Well, I feel like I'm with my brothers and sisters that we've never met. So I'm honored to be here this morning. Humbled, really, actually. And I just want our time together to be something meaningful and helpful for you. I can go deep in the weeds, like Mason can tell you. I can sort of have an idea and go way off base with it. So I'll try to be concise as much as I can this morning. But I'm an integrationist, and some of you are as well. I know that's what you do, and have the professional identity that you have. And I try to explain to people, when you make an agreement within yourself to be an integrationist, it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding. You're always trying to take new information and integrate it to what you from your subjective experience have found to be objectively true to you. Okay, but it's also work that's never done. There's always new things you're looking at. You know, it's explained. It's always messy. You know, sometimes you think, wow, and you sit with things and thoughts come to you, and you say, well, how does this integrate with this, and how does this connect with this? But I also found, as being an integrationist, that you disappoint people because they thought they knew where you were on something 2 weeks ago, and it changed yesterday. And they get upset with you. What I thought you believed, 2 weeks ago I did that. So even this moment is an integration moment for me, and hopefully for you as well. Because I'm going to share things with you. Some of it may be old to you, some of it may be new to you, but it's very helpful. I'm really encouraged because as pastoral therapists, and I do identify as a Christian counselor in my private practice, it's a ministry. We're helping people. But it's also, if you're a little bit on the systems perspective, you're transforming families. And you sit with folks. Sometimes I'll ask a client, how does it feel to be the most courageous person in your family? And these are people who have had a lot of trauma, feel pretty beat up and battered. I said, how does it feel to be the most courageous person in your family? And that's a very different mantle for them. That's strange for them to someone to say that because they feel so broken. I says, but you're the one who's reaching out and getting help. And it will never be the same again. And so that's a piece of sort of what I want you to take with you today is that you're here collectively, but you also represent the capacity to change some things within family systems, within faith communities, and there's a lot of need. And so today's subject is heavy. For Saturday morning, but it's also very timely. Today, Saturday the 10th, ends the week of suicide awareness prevention. I don't know if that was intentional or that was providential. And so I grew up in a pretty low liturgical church, pretty conservative, and we had a small s sovereign God. You know, sort of small s sovereign. I've grown in my understandings of God's big S sovereign. I mean, you know, so I look at things as, you know, nothing is really maybe random or accident as much as we sometimes attribute to it. So maybe we're all here in this room together collectively. And this is a phenomenological experience. This group will never be together in this formation ever again. Okay? And it's hopefully it's not because you wouldn't invite me back, but it's because it's just the dynamics of things, right? Okay, so this is phenomenological. This is important. What's going to happen in this room today is important. Okay, and so this is something we need to be aware of. It's the same thing every time an individual or a couple or family walks through your counseling practice door. That moment's phenomenological. We cannot repeat that moment again. And sometimes just giving space and weight for that and awareness of that. I'm speaking to people that speak my language. Okay. One of the most poignant and beautiful stories in Scripture is found in the book of Job. And when Job's calamity hits him and his friends come from afar and sit for 7 days in silence, the Jewish people call it sitting Shiva. They sit for 7 days in silence. It's beautiful. It's poignant. This is a broken man. I mean, he's so disfigured and so broken by his illness and grief. You know, his wife, which I think we give her too much a hard time, she says, curse God and die. But we also forget she's a grieving woman as well. And sometimes people in grief reach out and say some pretty hard things to hear. And then his friends open their mouth, and it falls apart from there. And I'm always mindful of that the silence can itself be very therapeutic and stuff. But this morning, I want your silence to be either you're taking it in, but also if you have any questions, clarifications, or anything along the way. I want this to be real relational. And so I'm not up here just espousing things. I would love dialogue. So this journey into suicide research was born out of a lot of experiences. And so it's an unspoken reality, even in communities of faith. You know, and so a few years ago, Sunday evening service, I don't know how many of you still have a Sunday evening service. We have a Sunday evening service, so you have the worried or the faithful well who come there, you know, and it's usually a small congregation on Sunday evenings. So, but it was a Sunday evening service. And as I was speaking, I heard ambulance, I heard sirens, but I didn't think too much about it. I mean, our church is on a pretty busy highway. I didn't think too much about it. But I did hear them silence somewhere in the community. I mean, only to receive a phone call soon after service that they found one of our members had shot himself. So, you know, the recrimination of those who survive suicide sometimes, what did I miss? What did I not see? What did I not hear? But it also connected me back to my childhood experience at a church that I grew up in which one Sunday night, the former treasurer, he hadn't been treasurer of church too awful long. He had stopped being that. His wife came to church. She goes home to find he had shot himself. In the community I live in, within the radius of my house, I could probably count no less than 6 or 7 suicides through my childhood in that community. So I grew up with awareness that that's a reality, even in the faith community, even in people that you know. In the Upper Cumberland area, within the Church of Christ, we had 2 ministers commit suicide in about 5 or 6 years from each other. So that happens in communities of faith. And so we're not insulated from that. We're not protected from that. And so, and I think back in my clinical practice, you know, we always assess for risk, right? You know, have you had thoughts of harming yourself? And you had, you know, thoughts of harming anyone else? But even then, you look back in your case records. I've been practicing for over 30 years, and they're still the ones, what did I miss? What could I ask? And I don't know why today, but I was getting ready this morning and sort of reflecting what I was going to share with you today. And you know, I have a former client that I'd seen when he was a teenager. He's now serving a life sentence for 2 murders in our community. And I'm thinking, I would never have saw this. And it's really hard not to think back, you know, what did I miss? We all do that, right? Okay. I've done some work with first responders, and we talk about your good cases and your bad cases, your good calls and your bad calls. You know, and the bad calls you can't get out of your head. The one you didn't resuscitate, the one you didn't say. My oldest son, he's he lives in Montgomery, Alabama. He's an attorney for the state Supreme Court down there. But for a while, he was a student firefighter there locally, and then he after he got out of firefighting, he began telling me his stories. And I'm thinking, you know, man, I didn't realize how much trauma he had gone through as a student firefighter. You know, we run down this street. He says, I pulled a dead person out of the car in that ditch right there. But wow, you know, that's a lot for a 21-year-old person. And just how those things sort of hang with you and the awareness of it. So what's your experiences? I mean, and there again, do not disclose anything you're uncomfortable disclosing. And if any of this content's too heavy, you need to step out or you need to talk to one of us, you know, reach out to us. We're here to help support each other because this is heavy. Okay, this is being recorded. Yes.
Yeah, just for FYI, this is being recorded.
Okay, so
FYI. It will be on the website. So
okay.
Keep that in mind.
Okay. Am I right? This is a problem within the faith community?
I think it's a problem also within the mental health community.
Yep.
Faith-based mental health community.
Mm-hmm.
One of our own colleagues who was with us for many years committed suicide just last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a reality. Within the medical profession, psychiatrists have a very high risk of suicide within that specialty. Yes.
Based on your subject up there, that it's unspoken and it's not talked about much, but there's a lot of suicide going on between leaders of the Christian community. Like
Yes.
Pastor.
Yes. That's a reality. Yeah.
I'm familiar with a town in Georgia where the minister's church was having problems and he committed suicide in his car in the parking lot of the church. And 2 weeks later, the psychiatrist that was treating him also committed suicide.
Yep. Mm-hmm. These are just powerful experiences that we have. Anyone else? So I'm getting a lot of affirmations, head nods, and stuff. I think we're all sort of on the same page here. So part of suicide is sort of when you have these conversations, remove the stigma of having conversations about suicide, right? You know, open it up. I don't know. I always heard Augustine, but then later someone sort of said Augustine. I don't know if it's the correct way. Sometimes I want to. Why did he call himself? So is it Augustine or Augustine? But he sort of in the 6th century. I mean, there's 7 suicides in Scripture. It depends on how you treat Abimelech. There's 7 suicides in Scripture. Abimelech sort of had himself done in by his armor bearer. So, but if you count that as a suicide, and then I thought, well, would you? But I said, well, we also talk about people who go out and put police at a standoff, but we consider that a suicide. So I think, okay, I'll count Abimelech in there, okay. But then you have Saul, King Saul, who fell on his own sword, Of course, Judas, a very famous one. And what's really interesting, 7 suicides, but no biblical commentary at all about suicide. There's no statement of condemnation. It's just like, and so-and-so hung himself, and so-and-so fell on, and there's nothing. But Augustine, he was commenting actually on the 10 Commandments. Okay? And he sort of went off, thou shalt not kill, and went into this. And this is city of God. We understand that a man, this is of course translated, not by me, we understand that a man may not kill himself, since the commandment thou shalt not kill, there's no limitation, add, or exception in favor of anyone, at least of all in favor of him who the commandment is laid. In other words, thou shalt not kill applies to you, and that means you. And so that was Augustine's interpretation of that commandment. Okay? And so most of us, whether we realize or not, within our faith organizations, he laid a lot of foundation. Okay? And so around the 5th or 6th century, suicide began within the Christian community take a new dimension. Okay? In some cultures, it's considered the honorable thing to do. If you just honor your family, whatever. But we also understand that we Westernize Scripture. It was really written from an Eastern perspective. And so maybe some of the silence on it is from more of an Eastern perspective of things. But we look at this. So in Catholicism, eventually suicide joins the list of mortal sins. Okay? But who do we sort of attribute this to? Well, St. Thomas. St. Thomas was the first that we see that he said this is a mortal sin. So wherefore suicide is contrary to the inclination of nature, and the ideal is that man should love nature. That was sort of his premise. That man's connected to the natural world because God created the natural world, God created man, so man has a natural affinity to the natural world, and therefore to not love oneself is to not love the natural order of things. He argued from a very philosophical perspective that you must love the things that God loves. And if you don't love you, then that's wrong. And so this is one of the first earliest recording. It may have been shared verbally, but earliest recording that suicide is a mortal sin, and being contrary to the natural law and to charity and the basics of love itself. So, what did this bring about? Durkheim argued years ago that religion itself had some protective factors against suicide. is one of the first persons who sort of had this perspective. So was it because we had good theology about, the value of the human individual, or is it because we didn't want people didn't want to go to hell or purgatory? I mean, why were people avoiding, the subject and talking about it? So this was the most recent thing I found. It was a survey actually in Europe. So I wonder what it would look like if we replicated this, but this is out of the journal British Psychiatry. And this was looking at over 1 million people. It was a huge N for those of you into research and stuff. A huge N looking at different groups, statistically looking at suicide rates within the European Christian community. So, and they looked at Catholic youth. This is per 100,000. One's too many, right? One's too many. We agree on that. One's too many. Yeah. But 15.1 was the mean of the different groups they looked at. It went to 13.2 to 17 of the Catholic community per 100,000 population. Now, remember, the Catholic community still holds suicide as a mortal sin for the most part. Okay. The Protestant community, it dropped a little bit. Conservative Christian, 9.2, it's dropped even more. But when you compare it to no religious affiliation whatsoever, it's still 14.4 per 100,000. So arguably, that for young, there may be some protective factors, but when you go to age 55 to 74, part of the reason that the numbers change is that just things get to us. The older we get, right? Okay, get to us. And so suicide rates begin to drop in rank order of the causes of death as we get older. It's not that suicides don't occur, it's that other things will get to us first. Okay? So we see these drops, within this. But interesting, we didn't get a lot of change here. Yes?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But this isn't thought through, but it's tickling my brain. I think what I see, what happens in the older population is there are suicides that are not recorded. They are in the healthcare system. I currently am seeing a hospice person who stopped eating 5.5 weeks ago. He will say it's suicide. It's thought through, the hospice people, but there's a lot of deaths that I witness in the healthcare, which is because they no longer want any interventions. They stop dialysis. It is an active way for them to take their last step of control against the healthcare system, but it's not recorded as a suicide.
That's a tough one. Okay, several years ago, I was called to do an evaluation on a young lady. She had severe respiratory problems. She was in her late 30s, I guess, at the time, and the family had exhausted every resource. They went out west for a while to try to live. It was debilitating. She always knew she'd have a short life expectancy. And she had went to respiratory failure, and she was put on a ventilator. And she was on a ventilator for several days, and she was transferred from the hospital to a nursing home. And they said, "You're not getting off the ventilator." And so her request was, "I want to be off the ventilator." And so I was asked to evaluate her whether or not she was competent to make that request. And it was a simple request. And she says, and to her perspective, she says, "I just think we're frustrating God." She says, "I think maybe God's ready for me and everyone else is not ready for me." And so, and I thought, wow, okay, that's a very mature spiritual perspective. She was competent. She says, "I'm not suicidal. I just don't want to live on a ventilator." And she says, I'm willing to go off the ventilator. And so I had to meet with the family, and convince the medical doctor this is not a suicidal request. This was simply a request of an informed person, knowing that she did not want to spend the remaining years on a ventilator and the quality of life. She was too young. She felt she was young, And so we worked out an agreement that she would be directive in how and when it would happen, and it was tough, and so she had siblings, and so she had never married herself, but she had nieces and nephews. And her request is simply die at home or someone's home. And so it was difficult, but we made the transfer. And on 4th of July weekend, she went to the weekend, and then working with hospice, she determined, after the weekend on Monday, she wanted to be off the ventilator. And so, and she had control of the whole thing, but later people said, was this suicide? I didn't look at it as a suicide. Her intent was not to not live. Her intent was not to live the quality of life ascribed to being on a ventilator and stuff. And so she passed fairly quickly and stuff at home.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
so,
you.
but again, I'm glad you said that, because it brings out a point. We don't think the numbers of suicide are reported as accurate, because medical doctors, MEs, if there's an overdose, they'll report it as an overdose if we don't have any context. So it's not a suicide, it's an overdose. Compassionate physicians sometimes realizes if there's a life insurance policy, if I list suicide as the cause of death, this may invalidate the claim against the policy. So in my family, it had been a family secret that my grandfather's father committed suicide. Okay, I had never been able to confirm this. My father's father was killed when my father was 7 years old. So, and then my father died when I was 8 years old. But it had been the hush secret and stuff. And he'd had some significant issues happen in his relative. He was in his 30s when he died. So, inquisitive me, I go to the state archives and I find his death certificate. His cause of death is complications of tuberculosis. No one had ever, tuberculosis was a big thing. No one ever mentioned anybody in the family had tuberculosis. No one ever mentioned that. So I'm here today, I still don't know. Did he die by tuberculosis, or did a compassionate physician in the community say, death by, complications of tuberculosis? It's complications of tuberculosis. It's pretty open-ended. So I don't know. To this day, and so physicians still do that sometimes. MEs, if they don't know and there's other causes, they'll list the other cause. So we don't think our numbers are accurate. And I know in some of the collaborations I've done with Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, they don't think our numbers are accurate. They think it's a lot higher. So what does this guide us to? Okay. Yes.
Just an aligned issue before we move on. Something I learned when I served on the ethics committee for a hospital in San Diego is it's a languaging issue. And that is that we withdraw treatment, but we never withdraw care.
Right.
And that came up recently with a physician, and I felt like I spoke up too quickly, but I said that, and he said, "Thank you, I really appreciate that."
Mm-hmm.
That we withdraw treatment, but we never withdraw care.
Mm-hmm. And as you shared that with me, it reminded me of a more contemporary discussion on the death of Sigmund Freud. You know how Freud died? Freud had contracted oral cancer after he had left Austria and come to England, and he had advanced oral cancer. And there's now this questions: did Freud actually die from cancer, or did Freud have a physician-assisted departure? Because Freud was a very proudful person, if you read his writings and stuff, and history of interpersonal relationships. But there was some conversation with something like this to one of the attending physicians, because he was afraid of losing his cognitive abilities, and Freud made this, promise me I will not suffer. I don't think it was pain, I think it was indignity. And the promise is, I promise you will not suffer. And he intentionally had very high doses of narcotics. And so so there's this fine line between palliative care that we see, and those of us who've worked in medical communities, a fine line between palliative care and helping people ease out. It's tough. It's tough. And probably everyone in this room has been with someone in the last moments of their life. And that is a very, I can say to you, a very holy experience and a very healing experience. I grew up with people from the 19th century, okay? My grandfather was born in 1885. We lived in a multi-generational household. He lived to be 103. My grandfather was at my wedding and stuff. And so our people died at home. That's just what they did. They just took care of them at home. And my wife marries in the family. She had never had that experience. She said, you sleep in a bedroom when someone died? Yeah. I said, I actually sleep in the same bed they died in. Ooh, how do you do that? She said, don't that freak you out? And I said, no. It was part of my experience. People died, And then later, when my grandfather died at home, my wife she worked in healthcare for several years. She'd been around people dying in hospitals. And we were driving home after the funeral home to come pick his body up. We were driving home, and she said, "This is the way it's supposed to be." She said, "This was just so humane." And I can tell the whole story of that week of his death, but it'll make you aware. Okay, share your thoughts. Yes.
One more thing before we leave the slide that showed the information about suicide rate. What I've learned is that we have to keep in mind that sometimes the populations that are studied are very restricted, very limited, and that if you look at a population of different culture, different race, and so forth, that it can look very different. So we need to kind of find that kind of research if we're treating certain populations.
I'm so appreciative that you said that, and because
could you repeat the essence of what you said?
Yeah. So the essence of is that sometimes we need to look at the numbers because population is different, culture is different, and how they perceive things, and sometimes people are very under assessed in certain communities, and if we're not real careful, we make statistics sort of make a broad brush, and sometimes it's not always relevant and stuff. So thank you. And we're going to talk about a study that speaks specifically to that issue and stuff, because we've got some information from a study, a relatively large sample size, but it was not representative of the population, the limitations of that, and the nuance effects of that. Other things, thoughts? So,
it seems to me difficult not to be respectful of Augustine's statement.
Mm-hmm.
But I come from a tradition which, in Baptist life, treats scripture and religious tradition in pretty strong categories.
Mm-hmm.
So holding those up as norms feels to me like worthy of consideration.
Mm-hmm.
However, I also encountered in my education a theme called the critical method. And the critical method seems to me to be something I learned in pastoral counseling, that there's a difference between God and the idea of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we can treat the idea of God as if it is the norm.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not God, because the mystery of God is bigger than the idea of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so then Augustine comes under critique,
Mm-hmm.
In what ways is he informed by such statements? In what ways are the people who come to me
Mm-hmm.
informed by norms of some sort?
Mm-hmm.
And while I respect those, I do not treat them as the end all, including Holy Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
I respect Holy Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
but I recognize that interpreting it is a rather tenuous process sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And having lost both friends and clients to suicide, I find myself respecting their choices.
Mm-hmm.
That in the world that they had lived in, it seemed a suitable choice. Yeah. Not with everybody, but with many.
Spoken like a true integrationist.
And the pain of that respect.
Yeah.
And I hear the pain of
Yeah.
wandering that
Yeah.
in you.
Yeah.
But that you give that respect. So what you're asking of us costs something to let someone have that kind of freedom and respecting the freedom.
So
I do.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. That's what you're telling us. That's your respect cost though of you to honor someone else's freedom.
Yeah, I lost a friend who was a pastoral counselor last year. But I had visited with him over the phone for many years about a terrible depression that he experienced. And then I learned after his death he also had a drinking problem. And those two together must have been part of his choice.
well, when we look at successful suicides, people who end, over half have alcohol in their system at the time of death. So alcohol lowers inhibition, and depending upon the method and quality method of choice that they use to end their life, it also causes blood to not coagulate as quickly. So it could be a factor in that as well. So, but we'll get into some demographic things as we go through. But there's been some limitations in looking at the demographics. Just say that. So I guess if there's some, I guess to sort of set, I relate to David back there. I like to cook. I like to cook for people. I like for people to enjoy food. And it's just sort of how I grew up and things. But have you ever prepared a meal you ever had kids or grandkids? You go through prepare this meal and they look, ugh, I don't like anything on the table. You ever had that experience? I didn't have that experience because we didn't have that privilege to make those kind of comments. You ate what was put on the table and you ate it with Thanksgiving without asking, like Paul said, right? So and I realized I ate things that other people just, this sounds gross, but I still crave liver and light hash in the fall of the year. I just didn't know what it was. But it was chopped up pig liver, chopped up pig lungs, put in onions and black pepper and a lot of sage and a baked sweet potato. And that we would feast on that for 2 or 3 days. Okay, now that just freaks people out. But I also drink buttermilk on a daily basis sometimes. People from my generation, from my folks I grew up with, you didn't waste anything. But I guess if there are major things that you want today, that you say, I will not leave here satisfied. Yes?
Yeah. I would love for you to address how to take care of ourselves in the face of, well, so-and-so didn't actually fulfill the requirements that for indicating suicide. I always thought it was a possibility. I asked the right questions. They never came to the threshold where I was supposed to call 911. Mm-hmm. Now I got to live with me after they've done this, and the same for homicide. Yeah. Okay?
Self-care. Self-care if you're on it, so I don't forget. So make sure we self-care post-suicide or homicide.
Right. Yeah. And from both my own emotional, spiritual point as well as the legal perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. We'll definitely circle around to that. Okay. Anything else? I only think if you wanted a bologna sandwich and didn't get it. Yes.
We're asking if there's going to be a break at some point.
Yes, there is a scheduled break. Mason's a break taker. Mason will remind me of. Mason realizes that I don't stop talking. He's helping coach each one of my classes, and the student says, "Can we have a bathroom break?" If you must.
Yeah, our scheduled break is at 11.
Okay.
Thank you.
But there again, I'm gonna make this statement, don't be offensive, okay? Your mind cannot absorb more than your butt can endure. So if you need to get up and move or go to the bathroom and be comfortable. I had a professor that I got that from, and he got me in trouble, Dr. Crowd. He would tell us, and he says, you're in doc school, he said, no, you're in master's school now. He says, you don't ask permission to go to the bathroom, you just go to the bathroom. He said, I've reached the point in my life, the most important thing is to be comfortable. So one Sunday morning, we're getting ready for church, and my wife says, how do I look? And I says, honey, the most important thing is that you be comfortable. That was not the right thing to say to my wife. I mean, you look nice, or how do you feel about how you look? That'll be and to this day, she says, I can't believe it. It's like, it's just give up. You just be comfortable. Yes.
I'm wondering, with some clients I work with that may be dealing with bipolar, maybe with some borderline in there, and there's kind of a continual narrative of suicidal ideation is there all the time, but it's maybe, I would call it maybe a bit more passive suicidal ideation. Just call it, what our responsibility is legally, such like when they come in and every time I meet they're suicidal, but do we need to put them in the hospital suicide?
Ryan, I think I'm going to give you a contemporary model that explains suicide, that addresses some of those important issues that you mentioned. All self-harm is not suicidal. If you ever worked with adolescent females or even males that do cutting, they're not suicidal. I mean, and we can't always assume they're suicidal. I worked with a professional lady one time, and she says, I cut, and I thought, I don't believe it. I mean, she was, well respected in the community. She says, I've done it since I was a kid, and something like that. And she says, I just do it on the inside of my thighs. And she said, that way it doesn't show. And she had an understanding history of it. Yes?
Just a flow chart, assessments, like what are entry points and next steps. And
I'm actually that's one of the slides. And so, actually 2 or 3 of the slides and stuff. So, So anything else? Okay, when we look at the big picture, and this is the most recent stuff that's been put out by the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, 12th leading cause of death of Americans. But when we look at certain groups, and we're going to look at certain groups, it's like the second leading cause of death. Okay. So, 20 to 34-year-olds, it's the second leading cause of death. It follows vehicular injury and vehicular death. Suicide second. Okay. So, and we're getting a little bit of research. This is one of the groups that I've researched because it's such a common occurrence in this age group. So, but even looking at ages 10 to 9, suicide is the third leading cause of death of kids between the ages of 10 and 19. Over 65, over 55, over 130 people who died with suicide over 55 are older. I don't know how accurate this number is here. 10% have thoughts of suicide. Of course, those of us working clinical populations feel like everybody, right? So 1.12 million suicide attempters who survived. So they're common. They're common in our practice. They're common in our church. They're common in our community. A lot of people who have attempted but survived. So over half the people have been affected by suicide some way. And of course, this is, if we did this, the population would be 100%, right? The clinical practice, personal experiences, we're talking 100% in this room have been affected by it. Veterans, we recognize they have a very high rate of suicide. And we talk a little bit more about that. In our country, suicide, 54% of suicides were by firearms in the U.S. We're looking at the U.S. as general. We look at males 3 times more than females, but this is successful suicide attempts. But females attempt suicide at higher rates than males, but they choose less lethal means. I had one client, she said, "This sounds vain." She attempted her suicide attempt. She overdosed. She said, "This sounds vain." She says, "But I didn't want to be an ugly corpse." She said, "I know that sounds vain. It sounds silly at the moment." She says, "But I didn't want to be an ugly corpse." And that's what she chose, a less lethal mean. So 90% have some diagnosis at the time of their death. That still leaves 10% unaccounted for, right? No history of treatment, no history of diagnosis, no history of ever taking medication. There's still the 10% we scratch our heads about. Huh? They're the ones who shock us. It's like, how could this be? So you look at those a little bit. 46% of all people 18 and over with a mental health condition actually receive treatment. So less than half of people with a diagnosable disorder actually receive treatment. And 72% of the United States, there's not an accessible community health center in their community. That's 72% of the United States. So that's the big picture, but let's bring it closer to home. So Tennessee is ranked in the middle third. So there's our rate, 17.3 per 100,000. So we're in the middle group. You look at some states like Alaska has a really high rate of suicide. You look at like Montana, 25.88 per 100,000, have a really high rate of suicide. So but Tennessee, we go up and down a little bit, but the most recent data were 17.3 per 100,000 deaths for suicide. So more specifically, we look a lot like the national average. We hit that second leading cause of death of that young adult group. When you look at Tennessee, we're 21 in the nation in the ranking of suicide. But here's where it changes a whole lot. The disparity of accessible mental health services is traumatic in Tennessee. If you look at the big map, you have Davidson County, you have Knoxville area, and you have Memphis area. Those are the only areas in Tennessee that have adequate levels of community health services. In our area, we have one county. If you look at how many mental health providers are available in that county, it says 1 per 44,000 residents. Actually, there's 0. They just didn't want to report 0. They just projected a number that says surely there must be someone there. So, and pretty much they just gave a number, but that's pretty much our case in the Upper Cumberland. I mean, Cookeville we have a few, but we have some counties. I don't have the slide here. We have many counties in Tennessee that don't have a hospital. If you don't have a hospital, you don't have continuum of care. Yes.
While you're talking about data, can I drop in just one more?
Please.
That I've used in presentations a few times, and that is I asked audiences what profession or class of labor has the highest suicide rate in the United States. Does anybody here happen to know? What type of worker?
Mark, can you repeat that for online?
Yeah, farmers. Yeah, what group has one of the highest rates of suicide?
Map of the United States, those are predominantly farming states.
That's an excellent point.
And I will add something I just heard on that today. There's a organization called Address Something where they're doing a hotline specific for mental health for farmers, and they're in 5 states now, and they're trying to get it across the country.
Yeah, that is really
When
important.
you think of who the most precarious workers are, who depend on weather and issues they cannot control,
Right.
not to mention, we talk to tractor parts. So
Yeah.
it's hard to have a viable business. I think economics and suicide is very hard.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone doctor knows. Yeah, Dr. Terry Pruitt. He practiced with Dr. Terry Pruitt here in Nashville. He's one of professors, and he farms on the side, and I farm a little bit too. I got 22 acres and pigs and cows and goats and chickens and stuff. But I went to a conference one day, and we were talking farming. He says, I finally figured out how to make a small fortune in farming. I said, really? Share that with me. He says, start out with a big one. So, yeah, but thank you. That's a very important thing. And then we think about where we are. What percentage of our citizens live in rural communities and are farmers or relate to farming. So, 66% of the U.S. population lives in a rural community. But we don't talk about rural community needs very well. But 66% of the population lives in a rural community. So it's important for us to recognize. So we have a lot of mental health disparities in our communities. Okay? Our churches sometimes are our potential front lines for mental health services in the community. Screenings, assessments, and so forth. It's really, really important. 4 times as many people died in suicide in 2019 in alcohol-related vehicle accidents. Sometimes when I'm traveling to Nashville, there's a big banner, there's a big what's it called? Digital sign going on there. How many people died by not wearing seatbelts or accidents and like that? Don't be the next one. I'd love for sometimes the messaging about suicide prevention up there as well. So this is a stat. I don't know how and why they pulled this up, but it was really powerful to me. If you represent those 2019 suicides, if you looked at the projected age of 65, that meant 24,098 potential years of lived lives were given up in that year. 24,098 years of potential lived lives were given up in that statistic. I never saw him projected that way. But that's a powerful number to me. Tennessee has a higher rate of death by firearms. I've been privileged to get to present at European conferences in Spain and Belgium on some of the research I've done with colleagues. And I went to one of the training sessions there, and it was talking about, the whole thing is that limiting risk factors for suicide. And I was really thinking I was going into a thing that we're going to talk about firearms. Pretty novel in my experience. They were talking about how to make houses less risky for suicide attempts, but they were talking about breakaway shower heads and making sure the toilet, the toilet paper holders weren't secured to the wall, because they said that people in institutions actually commit suicide by hanging themselves from the toilet paper holder. And it was early in my career. I was with community mental health. We had an inpatient unit. I happened to be off the day, but we had a young lady there, bipolar disorder, beautiful young lady, artistic. She could draw anything. She was engaged. Her parents were professional. Her fiance was very much involved in trying to get her care. She was coming off a manic episode. She was depressed. She was on suicide watch, which means every 15 minutes someone had to lay eyes on her and know what she was doing. So they went to lunch that day. She went to her bed. She went to her room. She went to the bathroom, and the next 15-minute check, lunch to 15 minutes, they would go to the bathroom. The bathroom door's locked. She won't respond. She would not respond to the door. So eventually they had to call maintenance, get the door down, and before they got the door down, she had taken off her jumpsuit. This is the psyche. She had clothing on, but you don't have any shoestrings, you don't have any belts, you don't have anything. She took off her jumpsuit, twisted knot, made a noose, and hung herself from her shower rod in the bathroom, which had been successfully secured to the wall so it could be weaponized by somebody on the unit. And she was not able to be resuscitated. And so, of course, we had critical incident debriefing for anyone who wanted to participate. But it really said when someone's intent on doing your very best, you cannot stop them, even in a secure unit. And it's a challenge. And they went through and did all these things afterwards. They even took the glass. They took down all the mirrors in the bathrooms and replaced them with these sort of Mylar things that really were useless as far as a mirror. But when someone's intent, they're intent. Okay. So the 988, if you're not sort of sharing that information with people, that is the new crisis line number for suicide. So instead of counting the 1-800 numbers anymore, Call 988. That's the new number, and we should maybe make that available, post that in our practices and maybe in our faith communities, because instead of going to 911, which is police, it's 988. It's specific to suicide, and they can route and reroute calls as they need to. But that's the new national number. Became effective in July, 988. Instead of 911 for suicide, 988. Okay. So this is back in my developmental days as a therapist. When as my students point out, this Dr. Loftis, you're alive, and most of these, theorists. Carl Rogers died when I was in grad school. But this was sort of my training backgrounds. Told me that suicidal statement, suicide was one of the most stressful things for counselors to deal with. In real practice terms, I agree. It's still real stressful. Some of these things are a little bit dated, but these are all somewhat. Another study about the same time still ranked suicide statements as being the most stressful things that we deal with. I found a more contemporary one, and it was about managed care. Actually made its way to the top. So those of us who ever dealt with managed care. So it's something that's a real factor. I mean, and we were all in our formal training. Had some level of training about how to assess a suicidal client. But there again, asking, do you have thoughts or intents on harming yourself? That's pretty direct. But for those of us who work with people who have severe persistent mental illness, they know the game. And I've had people say, I don't want to answer that truthfully. Why? Because you'll put me in the hospital. They know how that works. Yes?
And to that end, when you use the word harm, are we not to use the word kill? Because harm, to the very point you're making about
right.
the splitting of hairs. And
right. It's semantics and stuff, They don't
intend to just harm themselves.
Right.
They intend to end their life.
And I may rephrase that again and stuff. What I don't want people to say, you don't think about hurting yourself, are you? So you're already acknowledging your discomfort with a statement about someone hurting themselves. Oh no, I wouldn't do that. But I don't know. To be cautious, I don't know if there's any specific phraseology that's going to get the yes or no that we always need.
The point I'm making is if you say just harming yourself is not the same as saying you intend to end your life or kill yourself. Mm-hmm. And the particularity and specificity is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was in training the other day, and this person works in a maximum security prison, and they're always dealing with suicidal folks. And she shared something I never had heard anyone said. This person had been, in and out, on suicide watch and so forth. And then, she finally said one day, "Who are you trying to get to by your suicide?" Who are you trying to get to? He says, "My mom. My mom." She said that was the first time I really felt like I had anything actionable to do with him. And sitting down and let's talk more about this. So and that's one of the things Schneidman we'll talk about a little bit. He talked about in doing his psychological autopsies. He found certain things that were helpful, but he talked about the aggression. Suicide is a statement of aggression, getting away from. But this was a different side of the coin. Who you're getting to in doing that. So,
Mark, can I see the microphone?
Yeah.
The batteries are dying.
Okay, so hopefully it's not me. Okay. This is the father of suicidology. If you don't know Schneidman, I didn't know Schneidman. I never heard him until I started doing my research, to start doing my doc research. And then he sort of really got in my head. Passed away a few years ago. He was actually doing active work into his 90s. he was affiliated with a lot of things, but most of his work was in California. He began with an inquisitive mind. What are all these files laying around here for? Those people who commit suicide, can I have access to those files? And he really sort of did a qualitative approach of looking at people who had successfully completed suicide and say, okay, what are the common things? So qualitative work is really helpful. It's looking at things through just the lens of the person's phenomenological experience and seeing how does this relate to people across different experiences. So he came up with 10 characteristics of suicide. He started the Association of Suicide Research, American Association of Suicidology, in 1968. So our field of suicide research is only about 60 years old. So it's a little over 60 years old, but it's not as long as some other things, but it's helpful and fruitful. I don't know that we always get the research into training as much as we should, so I'm hopeful that maybe today you hear some things. But as we look at Schneidman, I think I said Schneidman, I say Schneidman, but I think it's Schneidman. As you look at what he's saying here, this answers probably questions about what do I need to be listening for? What in this person's statement fits his model? And we're going to fine-tune it a little bit with Thomas Joiner's interpersonal theory. We're going to fine-tune it in just a few moments with that. So, but the common stimulus is endurable psychological pain. He coined the term psych-ache. Psych-ache. P-S-Y-C-H-E-A-C-H-E, I think. Psych-ache. He believed that suicide was about psychological pain. Now, a few years ago in the medical practice, they began having people do pain rating scales. Remember? And that got us in a whole big opioid mess. Okay, how bad is your pain? They had little faces there that you'd point the thing. The doctor's okay. The doctor had assessed for pain, and he had to prescribe for pain, and we got a big mess with that. But anyways, how often do we measure relative psychological pain? On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this for you? Schneidman argued that psychological pain was one of the biggest reasons people commit suicide. Now, his antidote for psychological pain, his antidote was love. I heard an interview for him at the end of his practice. He says, if I had another career, he's like 80-something years old, and I had another career, I would not study the dark side of this, the human experience. He said, I would study love. He said, if I had another career, I would not have studied suicide. I would have studied love. If I had another career. Because he thought that was it. That was sort of the thing. So, then there's
no suffering associated with love?
Yeah, well, that's it. Yeah. Well, according to Paul, there's quite a bit, right? It suffers long. Yeah. So frustrated psychological needs. Think of Maslow, his hierarchy need. Okay, and what the current theory we're going to look at, psychological need can be belonging. Okay, the connotative, and that's not a word I was familiar with when I started reading this stuff. I don't know if some of you make me have better vocabulary than I do. I'm sure you do. But it's just your natural tendencies, your impulse, striving, directive. So suicide's a solution. So I put the 3 so I can keep up with the 10, but he broke these into subdomains. Suicide is the solution. And sometimes we've noted that people sometimes seem better before they commit suicide because they have a solution. Oh, I can end this psychological pain. I have a solution. Some of us feel better when we open the aspirin bottle before we take the aspirin. It's the anticipatory benefit of it, right? So the common is cessation of consciousness. It's not death. People just don't want to feel. People just don't want to hurt. People just don't want to experience. Sometimes the goal was not to die. The goal was to cease consciousness. And then suicide survivors say, I was foolish. I really didn't want to die. I just didn't want to feel blank. I didn't want to suffer anymore. So the common emotion of suicide is hopelessness and helplessness. Of course, Aaron Beck, Dr. Beck just passed away just not too long ago. He again functioned well, high level to his 90s. And didn't get to meet Aaron. Got to have some training under Judith Beck, but his daughter. But the Beck depression scale. You ever look at Beck? Okay, 2 questions. There's a suicide question and a hopelessness question. Dr. Beck said the best predictor of suicide was not the suicide questions, but the hopelessness question. So when I was doing, I did a small sort of a pilot research when I began doing my stuff, and it was my doc program. So, and I was using the Beck Depression Inventory as one of those scales, and so one of the schools said, I couldn't use the Beck Depression Inventory because it asked college students about suicide. They might like put the idea in their head. I was like, okay, this is a very, very uninformed perspective from an IRB committee that didn't understand suicide. They said, you got to take that question out. But it hurt the scale because you had this total score. I said, but I can take that suicide question. The question I'm most interested in was the hopelessness question. That was the most predictive question. So, but also was ambivalence. So ambivalence is not apathy. Ambivalence is, we get to ambidextrous. I can do it with both hands. So on this hand, I may feel like I don't want to live anymore. On this hand, I may. So sometimes a really good intervention is talk about someone's ambivalence. If you chose not to end your life, what's a bucket list thing you'd like to do again? What's a do-over moment? Yes, right.
Great question I picked up from Dr. Mark Crowell. Peter Hardiman was a social work guy. Mm-hmm. He would ask, what part of you wants to live? And then what part of you wants to die?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, if you're following Schwartz work and internal family systems about the parts, great stuff, rich stuff. But those parts questions are a really good. What part of you wants to live? I like that. What part of you wants to die? Speaking to the ambiguity, the ambivalence that they have. If you chose not to end your life, again, that choice, emphasizing it's a choice. What would you choose to do, or what's something you'd like to have experienced again? And it's interesting sometimes what people say. It's interesting. And what's really interesting is that sometimes they say, well, that would be possible, wouldn't it? Couldn't you go visit this person, or couldn't you have this conversation, or couldn't you do this? Or what's something that you want to experience again? So, the cognitive aspects is constriction. So that idea of bringing flexibility, remember, it's solution. They have come up with a solution, so they think this is the only solution. So there is no cognitive flexibility. So Schneemann looked at the records and said, people sort of got stuck in thinking there wasn't any other way. But what is the other way? So you move from a place of being very concrete to saying, well, is there another way of looking at this? Don't we sort of do the thing sometimes when people who are counseling are up against sort of a roadblock and they just can't get back, and we ask for creative thinking, or the solution focus approach? Can you think of a similar problem that you sort of faced in the past that you were very successful in overcoming? What did you do? And would any of that fit with this problem? So assuming that the situation is somewhat from within, but in truth, when people are actively suicidal, they reach the point, this is the only way. The cognitive constriction, this is the only way.
Can you go back to 7 and 8?
Oh.
I don't know why.
I may have missed the numbers up. Yeah, I've just missed the numbers up.
Okay, thank you.
So, cognitive constriction, in the serial aspect, it's a consistent pattern of lifelong coping. For many folks, according to the U.S. data, they have never contemplated ending their life. But the data says, the national number says 10%. I think that's underreported. Okay, I think that's underreported. I think the number is much higher. The percentage is much higher than that. In my clinical work, of course, we're seeing a very unique group of people sometimes, but it seems much higher than that. But I'm also going to show you in some of the data I've collected with college students, that's not right. That 10% is not even close to being accurate. Not even close to being accurate.
It's like a lot of folks use religion to dodge suicide.
Mm-hmm.
It's a servable. I mean, if suicide prevention is a reality that we should practice,
Mm-hmm.
which I even question that, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
somewhat, then religion serves a pretty good purpose.
Yep. It provides, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, if we conceptualize suicide from a biological perspective, how would we deal with it differently than we do currently? And we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So let's just sort of chew on that nugget for a while. So this, and I didn't know about Thomas Joyner until I got involved in my doc research. Thomas Joyner, out of Florida. Dr. Joyner has proposed a theory of suicide. It's an interpersonal theory of suicide, and Dr. Joyner is very open. He's a famous psychologist. He studied the field of suicide because his father committed suicide. I mean, a lot of us are in the room where we minister from where our woundedness is, right? So he says, this got me on the thing. I want to make sense of my father's death. I wanted to know. So he's very successful. And so if you get a chance to read his book, I think I've been very neglectful. Where's my handouts? Here we are. You've been so dutiful and I've been so engaged in what I'm doing. There you go. Now you're going to hate me. Now you're going to hate me. Thomas Joyner's theory really helped me in my clinical work. Because we can talk about someone's psyche, but I want to know, how likely are you going to hurt yourself? We can talk about your ideation. We can talk about even your plan. But I want to know, how likely are you to hurt yourself? So Thomas Joyner's theory says that for suicide to take place, three things must be present. A sense of thwarted belongingness. That came out in Schneidman's stuff, right? It's 10 things. Okay. A perception of functioning as a burden on others. The farming question. I'm a burden to my family. I failed. I'm not doing this well. And the last one is the acquired capacity for suicide. Now, that in itself is a, each one of these has multi-levels of complexities. Okay? So each one of these, I think I had 40, I don't know, hopefully there's enough. Sorry, you're home. We can maybe Mason can send you the Word document after the presentation. So he proposed this theory. It's interpersonal theory. It drives a lot of the research today in suicidology, but there's detractors. So I was fortunate enough to get presented at the Association of Suicide Research years ago. I never had met Thomas Joyner in person. I'm on the elevator. You chat with people on the elevator and like that. And I said, his name's Thomas. Hi, Thomas. Yeah, I'm Mark and stuff like that. Well, we never shared last names. We go to the keynote address and there he is. So he's all, yeah, just met me. But I heard some people just don't like his theory because they think it's too simple. I like his theory because it's simple. Okay. I like approachable, practical things. So thwarted belongingness comprise the desire for suicide. So there's a lot of people around here who don't feel like they fit in. There's a lot of people around here who feel like, I'm a burden to people, but they may not have the third component yet. I guess I'm getting closer. They're my age peers now, but the white-haired, godly, saintly people who've lived their entire life, feel like they've been Christians for 60 or 70 years. They've got it all figured out. They're just so holy. They feel like the angel's coming type thing. But you're struggling with their own faith issues and stuff. But I've heard these people express, "I'm just a burden. I can't do anything anymore." I don't take that as a suicidal statement from them. I think that's just where they feel like in life. That they're having to be on the other side of the towel now. And it's hard sometimes for people who like to be givers to be on the other side of the towel. And I just sort of remind us, hey, we believe in a Savior that says if you want to follow Him, you got to be able to be on both sides of the towel. You got to serve other people, but you got to be willing to be served too. And you got to both sides, and this is your time to be on the other side of the towel right now. So, so these comprise the desire for suicide. But the third point is before someone would choose lethal harm, they must habituate to physical pain and the fear of death. So self-inflicted injury does habituate to pain. People who've been in combat situations have dealt with death. People in the medical community, first responders, I'm going to show you some research with first responders. They deal with life and death every day, every shift, every phone call is a potential life and death situation. They can habituate it to death. Death don't seem so bad sometimes. It seems like a cessation of pain and suffering. And so we've even, some folks in the research community says, what about violent video games? In which you witness death and death and death. Those things contribute to the rising death rates of children and adolescents. They've been habituated to death and suffering. So and so it becomes to a model. I'm a very visual person. I like pictures. I like illustrations and stuff. I remember the Sunday school. I date myself. We used to get Sunday school cards years ago. We didn't have books, but they had like 3 or 5 cards. Anyone ever experienced that? I saw someone in an antique store and I was insulted. I really later wish I'd bought them and something, because somehow people don't want to talk about it. But you went to Sunday school and they gave you a little 3x5 card. They had the lesson on the front. It was illustrated, maybe a scripture on the back, and it was really great. And I remember those images. Sometimes even when I'm preaching, those images will pop up in my head and stuff. So. But this is it. A lot of folks walk around with this, but they're not suicidal here. And so it's that lifelong pattern of coping that Schneidman saw that makes us worry, right? Previous suicide attempts is the best predictor of future suicide attempts, right? People in chronic pain, people in the military, people who dealt with death on a regular basis. I said, I'd love to know, and I can't find it. I would be curious to know the suicide rates of people who work in the funeral home business. I don't know. It's a curiosity. I talked to some colleagues, and they said, well, so think of it. There have been some directors who took their life. That's anecdotal, but I'm curious. So what are these things? And then also I fold in protective factors. Within the African American community, we used to sort of get a relief. Okay, we have an African American male adolescent here. His rate of suicide risk, it's very small. His white counterpart, a lot higher. But the suicide rates from African American adolescent males has increased exponentially in the past few years. What happened? I think they lost some of the protective factors from their communities. What happened? I think some of the things that sort of kept them safe, they don't have anymore. Because those things weren't valued as much. we're seeing these changes, these shifts. So why people think about suicide? Amazon, get it? Read it. Thomas looks over his father's life and says, my dad did crazy things. He related a story one time. The swells were coming in. They lived next to the ocean. And there was a storm. Like warnings coming in. And his dad loads the kids up in a boat, an outboard motor, and just starts going in the ocean. It's like my dad was just risking death and fate. He said, at the time it was scary, but now I looked at my dad was just habituating himself to the concept of death. And we look at these lifelong patterns. I don't think everyone who owns a firearm is going to shoot themselves with it. But I think many people who have owned firearms, there's a potentiality for that, right? So capacity to death and suffering. My brother-in-law passed away a few years ago, but he said, I'll never be on a jury in a murder trial. I said, why? He said, because I work in a slaughterhouse. He said, they won't see us on a jury for a murder trial because we've habituated to blood and guts and gory stuff. We'll not be moved by that. So, prosecuting people don't want us, and sometimes defense people don't want us. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was his perspective. He said, I'll just say, I work in the slaughterhouse. And he said, they don't want to see him as a jury member on a murder trial. So, this is sort of where I wound up. Yes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. Yeah. We built a new building, we have a large auditorium, and they put a bell in because I don't know when to stop. I can't read the clock. So they put a buzzer in, and the buzzer they chose is the same buzzer sound that they do in basketball events. So I put in, takes them off the bench. But that's my 5-minute warning. So this is where I'm at. Okay. Suicide is the second leading cause of death of college students. Issue with this is, again, underreporting, because colleges don't report commuter students. They only report students who committed suicide on campus. We have a young man who took his life at Tech, and his parents have taken his death and don't want to be meaningless, so they started a foundation. And they do fundraising, they support suicide education prevention. But they said, our son's death was not reported as a campus death, even though he was a student enrolled at the time, because he died at home. So he's not reported as campus death. A friend of mine, she worked for Disney World for several years, and she worked in the police department down there. She says, no one's ever died at Disney. She said, I put pieces in body bags that died at the hospital, but no one ever died at Disney. It's how you report it, right? So it's the second leading cause of death of college students. This is a chronic problem. There's a population that there's a high death risk. The college students appear to have a higher suicide rate than their same age peers who are not in college. In my dissertation, I cite two different things where campuses were really being encouraged to do some pretty unhealthy things, I feel like, with college students. So if a student attempted suicide, was unsuccessful, they were encouraging universities to try to get them off the student roll as quick as possible, because they were putting potentially other students at risk. Two cases I cite, one student took his moped into his room and ran the motor and died by carbon monoxide poisoning, but he put everyone else in risk. One student, she took, I can't remember the sex on that one, but took gasoline to her room, set herself on fire. So, and so they're saying that you can't put other students at risk, so try to counsel those students off the campus if you can. Which is not intervention, by the way. I thought it was very, very healthy, but that's perspective. So it's still a reality. Universities from time to time, they report these big numbers. We're not immune at Tech. We still have suicide. We have a very good counseling center at campus and intervention stuff. So this also, if you've never heard the term, that's fine. You've never heard the term. Alexithymia. Some of you are familiar with it, some of you not. Okay. I was actually introduced to it. This is Siphonos, actually occurred in the text in a book, 1972. He was talking about psychiatric patients who just don't get well. And these patients have alexithymia. They just can't feel, they can't express emotions. And he looked at it as an issue in about how psychiatric patients at Beth Israel Hospital is one of the things that will predict poor outcomes for treatment. Okay. But this is where I got introduced to it in my doc program. I had a advanced curriculum class, and Irving Malone, and he's an existentialist, psychiatrist. Again, following him on Instagram, Facebook. still practicing, still putting stuff out there and stuff. But I read this quote in Mason's in that course right now. I'm teaching, so they're getting a full dose of him. But this is a quote, and for some of us, it's, oh man, it seems like, oh, I can't believe he's talking about this. But have you ever sat with a boring client? Not for you. Oh man, this session. This is really, and Yalom talks about it. Some boring clients are alexithymic. They have expressive difficulty stemming not only from neurotic inhibition, but cognitive deficits and the ability to identify and communicate feelings. The alexithymic client is concrete, lacks imagination, capacity, focus on operational details, and non-emotional experiences. And I even pulled my 5th edition of the book out. I remember writing in the margin that day, what's the relationship to alexithymia and suicide? Is maybe some people who are suicidal are saying things by their behavior that they can't say with their words. And we don't screen typically for alexithymia in the counseling session. We just know sometimes internally, man, this person's hard to work with. And let's be fair, there's a normal male alexithymia. You ask men how they feel, they can be hungry or be aroused, and that's about it. That's about the limit of an emotion. You ask a woman, how she feels, and she has 16 adjectives to describe a feeling, how you experience, and then, they can say 1 or 2 things, and that's about it. Or I'm okay. How you feel? Fine. It's in couples counseling. She says something very emotive. Well, how do you feel about that? Okay. We have a lot of work here to do. But there is a clinical level of alexithymia. So the argument is a state or trait. I think there are times in my life I've been alexithymic. I don't have words to describe this. But there are people who move through it as a trait of their life. We know that people on the spectrum have a hard time with this. People who on autism spectrum disorder have a hard time with expressing feelings. Well, if we look at that as a continuum, there's some people pretty high functioning that, that seems a little bit that way. I had students who've asked before, how do you differentiate between schizophrenia and schizotypal? Well, so one of them's itty-bitty schizo, the other one's really schizo. It's just itty-bitty schizo, really, really schizo. So, yeah, I'm seeing, okay. Break time. So, yeah. And if you want to talk to your break, I'm here. So.
We'll take 10 minutes.
I'm loving the energy in the room, the interaction, the sharing. I like this a whole lot. There are certifications you can get in psychological autopsy. You can get actually trained on how to sort of take clinical records and do the research. It's helpful for researchers and stuff, but I've known some folks who had an interest in that as well. So you can get trained in that. So we left here. So what is this relationship? My question was, what was the relationship between alexithymia and suicidal behavior, specifically in college-age populations? So I was able to gather data from 2 universities, a Christian university and a secular university. So when I looked at the numbers, University 1, which was the Christian university, it's a 17.2% had suicide risk. Now I used a measure. Some information familiar with Marshall Linehan, DBT. They took a suicidal measure that she did and brought it down to 4 items. Because again, the most predictive risk of suicide is past suicide experiences. So it was the suicide behavior questionnaire revised. And this was looking at not a current level of suicide, but a history of suicide ideations, plans, attempts, and then there's one question: how likely do you think you'll die by suicide in the future? So, but it's not an assessment. This is not an assessment used clinically to evaluate people, but it's a good research assessment looking at people's historical experiences with suicide. 4 questions, public domain thing. But so, have you had a plan? Have you expressed a plan? Have you ever had an attempt? And then one question: how likely do you think? And we were seeing consistently across a couple studies, about 1 to 2% of the college students responding to the survey said that they would probably, that's how they would end their life. That's how they would die. So it's very interesting. So, of course, with any study, if someone participates, they're directed immediately to crisis response, given resources and so forth. So when we look at University 2, 22.2% of students had suicide risk. So this is the stat side, but what we did, it proved there was a relationship between alexithymia and suicide risk in the college students. Particularly female college students were alexithymic. Female college students who had alexithymia had a greater risk of suicide than female college students who were non-alexithymic. But alexithymia had a pretty significant relationship to this. And so what we saw is for every point you increased on the TSS-20, which is a alexithymia scale developed out of Canada, every time you increased a point, your suicide risk increased a point. So there was a direct relationship between those two. So it says your alexithymia scores went up, which indicate alexithymia. So did your suicide risk. So for every elevation, it was tracking pretty closely. Of course, we can't do cause-effect. We're just simply saying correlations and stuff. So that's just a very short version of my dissertation, probably the shortest one I've ever did. But so then one of my former students, who later followed on behind me at Trevecca in my PhD program there, his background was working with emergency responders. He was a certified medic. He worked for fire departments and so forth. He now teaches at university with us, Tech. His dissertation was looking at emergency responders, and he took this alexithymic scale and saw that it didn't have any relationship with it. Because we already sort of demonstrated college students, but he also found that with emergency responders, the higher the alexithymic score, the higher the suicide risk based upon the SPQR. That had previous plans, attempts, or these are people actively working in the field of first response. Had plans, attempts, or told people of plans, or expressed the likelihood that they would die in the future. So there's significant, and particularly again among female and younger workers. But again, remember that age category, that 20-something, 30-something, have one of the third highest rates of suicide in Tennessee. And I think he had a national sample. It wasn't just specific to Tennessee. He had 628 participants. So again, alexithymia may be a better predictor of risk than some of the other things we've been doing all along. And so he's continued his research. He's got an active research going right now with first responders and risk, burnout, and risk factors. One of the things that looked interesting is that it was almost like as people got out of the field, they deselected out of suicide risk. The older workers were not as prone to suicide risk as younger workers. So maybe burnout was why some people were leaving the field. That's sort of a theory right now. But the older workers did not express that much suicide ideation. They lived there, been there, done that. But it was younger workers, younger people in the field, newer workers in the field who were having a higher suicide. Sometimes all research does is give you more questions. I'm sorry. Mason, I'm sorry. These agendas that come in, I was woken up at 4 o'clock the other morning, I got a great dissertation idea. Oh, I'm not doing that anymore. So, I talked to colleagues, so that's great. I said, well, when someone's desperate, I'll share it with them. So then a colleague of mine and one of Mason's professors there at Tech, Tony Michael, he's a national regional play therapist, play therapy supervisor, LPC. gobs of experience working with folks, but his whole background is attachment. Play therapy, child center play therapy, attachment. And he helped in his dissertation validate, to modify and validate a parental attachment scale. Adult paternal. You ask adults about their previous attachment to their parents. And so I was interested about that, and also through my research, I came across the ACEs study. You ever heard the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I'm wondering, what's the relationship, because the national sample, that 17,000 member Kaiser Permanente study that was all based upon, said it was 8 times likely that you had suicide risk as a factor if you had a high ACE score. 8 times. You had, of the 10 traumas of childhood that the ACE score looked at, if you had 4 or more, you had a 8 times greater chance of suicide based upon these childhood experiences. So that was my interest. Are we going to see that repeated in the college sample? Because the ACE study was, the original ACE study was problematic. Huge sample size. 17,000 people, huge sample size. Middle age, white, college educated people who had health insurance. It didn't even assess people of color hardly. It didn't assess people of different socioeconomic, class, or cultural backgrounds. But we've based a lot of things on the National ACE Survey. What I see in my area, in the Sycamore Institute here in Tennessee, saying, whoa, our numbers don't even look like the national numbers. We look like a whole other world. And now the ACE study is getting into Europe, and it's really interesting what's being found over there within different cultures. A high level of trauma in childhood. So, so what we did, it was a rerun of my original dissertation. This time we stayed with our college population. I didn't go outside of campus, just IRBs and stuff like that. So, pretty good sample size. But this is what was interesting. By the time I collected my original deep research, to about 8 years later, the suicide rate risk had increased. 35.4% had clinically elevated numbers regarding past experience with suicide, suicidal ideation, suicidal plan, or suicidal behaviors. We have a generation of people that it's more common than not. It's a third. 1 out of every 3 students on our campus had a history of suicide ideations, plans, risk. 1 out of 3. Women higher than men. Significantly higher than men. So scores of 8 or more. Yes?
So, what do we know about the existential ideation of these college students? I mean, what's intuitively going through my mind is, I was raised with a sense of meaning in life, connectedness to myself, to others, and to the all. And is there any way of evaluating that? What do we know? Intuitively, I have some ideas.
Yeah. Ryan, I think we could probably generate a lot and be more right than wrong. I have a long history on the campus. The family legends, my great-grandfather saw the first board and brother first nail and the first building on campus. That's the family legend. I can't verify it. But also know it was a tool shed, so maybe that was so they could not believe they're building the campus so far out of town. It's really laughable. We're 3 blocks from the main part of town, but that's not going to work. That's so far out of town. They built a tool shed so the guys wouldn't have to carry the tools back and forth. But years ago, we had this. It was sort of traditional Southern university. These big oak trees and big canopy of trees, and students would sit out and. Be honest, that's where a lot of people did their courting. Okay, back in my day, we did courting. They don't do courting anymore, but back then we would court. Okay, and you'd meet under the shade trees out there, and we call it the South Patio, and it's huge and something like that. And people would interact. Sometimes people would be out there playing music. It was interactive things like that. Okay, well they denuded the campus for the most part. They cut down all the big trees, and now we have these nice, centennial plazas and stuff like that in concrete. I walked through what had previously been the South Patio. Instead of people interacting, I see people doing this. Sitting inside people doing this. And to make eye contact is just really a hard thing for folks. So we've lost a degree of connectedness. We're the most connected but unconnected people I've ever been around. Okay, people follow people on Facebook that are so lonely, toxically so. You know, I do contract work for Head Start, and I love being around 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and they're challenging. They're challenging, and I'm the mental health consultant, so I get all the challenging ones. And I love being around them. They're a lot of fun and stuff. And they don't. I think they think I'm Santa Claus. I really do. Well, one of the teachers says, "Be good, Santa Claus is coming today," so they're wrong. Yeah. I was at one center. It was raining like it is today, and instead of going outside for gross motor, they had to stay inside for gross motor. And so they had a big room. And so the teacher, she was trying to get some, things they could interact with, and she just had a big basket of plastic food. And she said, okay, she just brought it out, sat it down, and this one little girl picked up a plastic banana and did this. Hello? And she came on this very really animated conversation with her plastic banana. And she was all animated and stuff like that. This is a 3 or 4-year-old little girl. Okay. That's not how people of my generation play. And I'll be real honest, I was a kid, I picked up a turned it into a gun. Bang. Let's play cowboys, okay? It's just a different experience. One little boy one day was in his Head Start Center, and he was at the computer station. He was doing this. I said, what's it? It's broken. I said, no, it's on a touch screen. He thought the monitor should be a touch screen because his whole world had been a touch screen. He's so frustrated because it wasn't. So I think, Brian, there's a lot of. I think you hit the word existential. How do we make meaning? How do we make meaning of suffering? I mean, Jim shared a minute ago. Think about the mystics. Suffering had a value. Don't avoid it. Learn from it. And then we make from a culture, you shouldn't be hurting. Yes?
Yeah, I have a follow-up to Brian's question and your comments, and I think this is a statement not about your presentation, but about, I think, the psychotherapy community as a whole. One of my critiques and observations is we over-psychologize the causes of suicide, for example. And what I mean by over-psychologize, we get like Schneidman did, we make a comment about the greatest predictor of psychological distress, and we think, oh, we've reached the foundation here. This is ground zero, is psychological distress, without asking what causes the psychological distress. And I think in the mix of what we're discussing right now is what I think is ground zero, which is social and economic factors. What's the water we swim in is what causes suicidality. That's what causes psychological distress. So when farmers are the greatest, highest suicides in the U.S., it's not because farmers are weak. It's because farmers feel shame facing bankruptcy, right? We shouldn't be surprised, likewise, that I just looked it up on the internet. So blacks from the ages of, get this, blacks ages 10 to 14, the suicide rate increased between 1995 and 2018, 233%. Are we surprised? I mean, look around us in the United States, at the incarceration of blacks, at the over-policing of black neighborhoods. All this is not a surprise. At the same time, somewhat incongruently it may seem, the suicide rates among whites is 60% higher overall than blacks in the U.S. I'm pulled up, have you all heard of Angus Deaton and Ann Case's book, which is getting a lot of attention, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism? So they have found that the mortality rate in the United States is actually declining. And the reason it's declining is the deaths of working class and poor whites in the U.S. Now what I'm making up is there's probably enough blacks who know that there's racism going on, and they have some sense of why they're feeling what they feel. I think we've raised generations of whites in this country that are oblivious to the social causes of their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they blame themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen in my clients is once people hate themselves, high suicide rates.
Well,
And not to mention opiates and other issues. So I just want to toss.
No, I'm glad you did. I think a helpful question sometimes is asked, where do you feel this pain? Where do you feel this pain? And the systemic part of it. Yes?
I don't know the reality of data on this, but Wayne Oates, one of my mentors, used to say anyone who's capable of suicide is capable of homicide.
Yes.
Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know whether the data indicates it, but I associate it with what Bruce is saying about the populations that are susceptible to suicide.
I'm going to have to chew on that one. I had never heard that before, but I'm going to have to chew on that one. And you think there's some truth in that?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, if you base it on what Bruce just said, then there has to be some sense of purpose in my suffering. And if I blame myself, I could just as easily blame some other group or some person. And so we see this rise in mass shootings. We see, rise in crime like that.
I mean, we see murder-suicide. I mean, we hear that a lot.
I'd like to point out here that with all the mass shootings going on in the United States, you all know this, these are predominantly young white men.
Yep.
Who are isolated.
Right. So one of the things that we began, alexithymia, again, she keeps showing up in the sample size. It's a relationship, inability to express internal emotional states. The TAS-20, the Toronto Alexithymia Scale, I'll say it has some wonky characteristics, but it's still, you get a hold of Dr. Bagby, you pay $20 one-time fee, and you have lifetime use of it. So I paid my fee and stuff. So not going to go into the psychological weeds too much, but there's an aspect of narcissism that arises in suicide. And we're all born with a base of narcissism. When I have grandkids now, that changes your whole perspective on things. But my grandson Griff, when he was, I'm 6 weeks old, he didn't wake up thinking, well, I'm cold, I'm wet, I'm hungry. But mom and dad had a real rough day. I think I'll let him sleep. No, he's a narcissist, a normal narcissist. Okay. Now, what happens is hopefully that Griff will come out of that. And I'll tell this story. Some of you are going to hate this story. Some of you are going to like this story. Most people hate this story. I'll tell you right now. We have two sons, Evan and Dylan. And my wife was home with Dylan after he's the youngest. She was still home on maternity leave. She was breastfeeding Dylan. Evan is 3 years old, 3 years older than Dylan and stuff. And he came to her with a book and says, Mom, when the baby doesn't need you, could you read the book to me? I came home that day to a crying wife and said, I'm failing as a mother. And she told me the story. And I said, all right. And she said, what are you happy about? I said, our son is developing psychology of the mind. He can see things from other people's perspective. I says, there are adults I work with who still don't have that. They got stuck in primary narcissism and they never got out. The DSM, if you remember the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the S stands for statistics. People jump over that. Look at the DSM, the personality disorders. 18% of the population should have one. So that's like one, you look at it, okay. 2 out of every 10 people that you meet may have a personality disorder. And then you go to certain communities, you go to the jails, that's everybody. Okay, I mean, really. Okay. My wife worked in nursing homes for several years as a physical therapist, and I read this research that said, did you believe that the rate of personality disorders in nursing homes is higher than the national average? She says, yes. She said, people keep the Squeedo grannies home, they sing the mean ones to us. So in nursing home settings, there's a higher distribution of personality disorders of old people, old borderlines, old histrionics, old narcissists. They're mean. They kept the sweet ones at home. But think about that. Think about church. The community of faith, there are some people who never got adult personalities. They're the most difficult people to deal with. Narcissism to them feels like pain. It doesn't feel like, you hurt my feelings. It feels like pain. And so they wear us out. They bother, baffle, and push us all the time. And so that's internal data we talk about, don't we, Dave? Mason, that's your internal data as a therapist we use. Man. And then so then wearing you out, you get empathetic. So man, I wonder if other people in life are experiencing this over and over again. And that's why they're not connected. That's why they don't have good relationships, because other people are bothered, baffled, and pushed by them. Okay, I'm getting off track. Childhood, 4 or more is clinically significant. I took the ACE test. I had 4. My siblings, my oldest brother died of 62 from liver disease. My brother wasn't a drinker. Never drink. My sister, 63, she died of undiagnosed kidney cancer. She was a nurse. She just retired. She got sick. She went to the hospital. She had blood clots. They sent her to Vanderbilt. Operated on it, but it was too far gone. So it progressed. Life expectancy in my family is really low, but for intergenerations, we had all these fathers to die. Hey, strong Southern women, I know. I was really shocked when I started doing clinical work at in-home family therapy with folks. I was really struggling identifying with traditional families, But my African-American families, I felt like I was at home. We had these strong matriarchal systems. That's how I grew up. These are my people. The intact moms and dads and all that. Sometimes I just couldn't relate to some of their stuff. It's like, really? So the ACE scores are important. You have the 10 questions. It's simply yes or no. I went to Theranest, not promoting Theranest, I don't get any kick. But I went to Theranest just to help with my practice management stuff pre-COVID, and then it saved me during COVID because I could do telehealth through it. But my intake questionnaire that you get is part of it's ACE questionnaire. You can put you can put your own stuff in there. But those 10 questions for any study, it had some things, but it still has legs of its own. So it's how many of these you say yes to? It changed my clinical work. Sometimes we don't even talk about it, but I know my clients fill this out ahead of time, and I know. And I had one client, she scored 9 out of 10, and we did talk about hers. And I said, what does this mean to you? You have 9 out of 10 of these adverse childhood experiences and have chronic HSP. She says, I went through a lot of shit. I said, yes, you did. And she says, I'm going to forgive myself for needing therapy. And I'm going to forgive myself for needing medication. And I had another client who had 10 out of 10. And she says, can we talk about these 10? Yes. She gave me an example of every one of them why she said yes to. She finished therapy in 6 months. She said that was the most helpful thing for someone to hear my story that I didn't know how to tell. And so, but it's validation for folks to say, well, you have a lot of trauma. A lot of trauma. It's how you define those things. I've guessed my father died at 44 of a massive heart attack. I guess he was a lot higher than mine. His father was killed when he was 7 years old. His father was a deputy sheriff and he was shot in the line of duty trying to serve a warrant. They grew up in abject poverty. My grandmother did her best. She had 4 kids. She was widowed. She would sometimes send the older kids to live with other relatives because she couldn't afford to feed them. So I know that there's physical, but the substance abuse runs my family too. I mean, we buried our alcoholics and drug addicts so far. We have a new generation emerging I'm worried about, but all of ours died early and died young. So these are 10 questions. They're very important. So we found that the ACE had a strong positive relationship with the predictor of suicide, especially with females with trauma. But I'm questioning the college population. Maybe the males, because college is not an equal thing. There's more females in college than males. Maybe the males with adverse childhood experiences never made it to college. Maybe they deselected out. They made bad choices or bad decisions and stuff. So also in the model is that a distant parenting pattern, particularly for the females, was a suicide risk. It's an attachment. So suicide, is it a statement about attachment? Possibly. That safe-based experience, if you've never had it, you don't have a model for it. The three-year-old who runs down the sidewalk today and skins their knee, the parental reaction to that may determine how the attachment goes. If the parent acknowledges the pain, that hurts. That's an ouchie, that's an owie. Let me kiss that, let me make it better. It's going to be okay. What did that child learn?
It hurts.
Life hurts. Validate it. But one of the things that Yalom talks about, insulation of hope, it will get better. But the 3-year-old who's told, you're tough, rub some dirt in it, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you. That's the message males get. You're fine. Be a tough guy. Big boys don't cry. Don't be a sissy. That was a word during my day. That's an offensive word. How many of us got that? Don't be a sissy. So what'd you learn? We already know that people carry infant girls different than infant boys. Caregivers hold infant girls to their face, facing them. They hold infant boys away from them. When we're born, we are born nearsighted. We see everything really close. Girls get intonation, facial expressions. Women know stuff that men don't know. They read nonverbals. You know, a woman would be slamming cabinet doors, looking angry, and her husband, are you mad? Are you upset? Why? Because he never learned that. Because when he ran down the sidewalk 3 years old, someone says, rub some dirt on it, you're fine, there's something wrong with you. Suck it up, buttercup. He's 3 years old, so what did he learn? I don't have feelings. It didn't hurt. I'm fine. I'm okay. I can't attach to you in a safe way, in a meaningful way. You didn't validate mine. So I'll just stuff these things. I'm okay. So I'll let my lexithymic. A little bit. So some sub-skill stuff, not that helpful. So where are we at right now? How much time we got left? 48 minutes. Oh my goodness. Okay. What have you heard that you didn't know, or what have you heard things can be helpful? Because we got more. But I put these slides in intentionally.
If I could ask a question that may seem random. Recently, reading in German, there was a book called Die Leiden des jungen Werthers. It was a piece of literature, a novel that inspired a lot of suicides among an educated class at the time, because there was a romance about suicide. Riot's question and my good friend's response over there has got me thinking about, Bruce's response, has got me thinking about the role of pop culture, which when I grew up was limited to radio, TV, and newspapers, and now it's everywhere. And it infuses everything, not just music, not just videos, but what do they call it? Fantasies of what's going on.
Yeah.
Along with socioeconomic causes, I wonder if there's a culture of death that is seeking, spreading, and whether people are cutting and attempting suicide in an attempt to find the meaning in pain.
I believe that. I was a very new clinician. I don't think the ink had dried my diploma. And I was working with a young man. And my level of unknowing is huge. I guess why I'm sort of wanting to always be an academician, so I can always have an excuse for learning. But he says, I'm a member of the Hemlock Society. I thought, botanist? You're a botanist? I didn't know what that means. He said, you know what the Hemlock Society is? I said, no. He says, a group of people who believe that suicide is a viable option for people. Okay. But it was a culture there. And this was years ago before internet was common. that he identified as a member of the Hemlock Society, and others saying, in other words, forecasting his own death and stuff. Now, just irony of ironies, he passed away recently, not by suicide, but he had some medical issues. I think there is that. I think there is that. I remember, there was a generation of people who says, I want to go out like Kurt Cobain. They valued this romanticized death. I mean, that's tragic. But you understand, values are culturally driven. And just because it's not mine doesn't mean it's not valid for that culture. So I think that there's, the current ACE, and this is not an ACE presentation, so we're bringing it in a little bit, but the current ACE presentation, now we're talking about the roots of ACEs. What exists in the community? What are the poverty, the cultural things? What are the things that the impairments exist that lead to these 10 adverse child experiences? And so John Hurry, if you have a chance, he talks about rethinking addiction is a YouTube thing, about 14 minutes long, things like a TED Talk. How one country sort of rethought their approach to addiction. So they actually stopped punishing people for having substance abuse problems. And the rate of addiction has gone down. The rate of overdose has gone down. They decriminalize every drug. Now, I have a hard time with some of this, okay? But some of the points were made earlier. Look, we criminalize drug possession and drugs, and we have people serving huge sentences because they couldn't have an appropriate representation. Or they didn't have the bucks to get a good lawyer. Their skin color was a strike against them. So we struggle. We struggle. Other things, because we got to get to Brian's request. So that's almost not funny, but that's the COVID virus. If you didn't recognize it, we just went through it. I get weird ideas, you can tell. I'm an integrationist, and I've got it on my phone. I can pull it up, but I got hung up on what if suicide's a virus? Like any virus is intent to maintain itself and kill the host. We're really not with the intent to kill the host. It just kills the host without really wanting to. It's like, dang, I'm going to die now too. But what have we thought of suicide? Yes, Jim.
I think it's a wonderful metaphor. My daughter is 50 years old, and before Christmas last year, her college roommate suicided. She was alcoholic. Mm-hmm. And my daughter lives in another country, and she's returned to the West Coast at least two or three times to be with the family. And she was home a month ago, and she was still talking about never having an idea that one of her best friends would have considered suicide. And so she's still processing that, and she's a pretty sensitive human being, more so than me. It's incomprehensible to her that she suicided.
Well, and the virus metaphor is intentional. I guess because we've learned a lot about it. It's just a baffling virus. I mean, it really, really is. When it first hit, I got immunization as quick as possible because my sister had died. My mother's 88 years old, 86 at the time. But I was sort of primary provider of her support. She still lives at home. She's a hero of mine. But I needed to make sure I stayed healthy and I didn't take anything to her. So I got vaccinated. We had a department chair at the time which thought this was like Armageddon. This was the end of the world. I mean, he just went home and never came back, basically. He just went home for 2 years and retired. So And, you know, he was determined, you know, that, you know, we're all going to die from it, you know, and so we had to have, you know, and so I said, well, I'm not going to be hypocritical. I said, I'm going to go to campus. I'm going to meet with my students. I said, I had small classes anyway. We can distance and stuff like that. I said, I'm not going to be hypocritical because I've still got to go to Head Start. I'm around 3, 4, and 5 years old following CDC guidelines. I said, I think college students can. And I said, in my community of faith, we hadn't stopped anything. I said, we're going to do it. I said, I'm continuing to meet with classes. He was so determined I was going to die with COVID that he had me have a designated survivor. I had to put someone else on my class, another professor in my class. He says, you're taking risks. I said, that campus wasn't closed. I'm going to meet with students and stuff. So that was my perspective. Some people thought it was foolhardy. But I didn't get it. I got every vaccine, everything along the way. And then so when we did close down, I continued my clinical practice. I had patients who work in healthcare. They don't have the option of not going to work. And so I couldn't say, well, I'm not going to see you, you know, because of your risk. We'll wear masks. We'll be smart. But, you know, but what COVID taught us that we have to treat everybody's potentially capacity to get sick. Now, some of us got pretty arrogant like I did. I took the vaccines. I got the booster. You know, by the way, don't take your booster if they say you can and your flu shot on the same day. That was a bad experience for me. You know, so they said, oh, take it. Don't say that. No, that was not good. So didn't listen to my wife. You know, so I should listen to my wife. So, but I got, in July, I got the virus. You know, I woke up that morning with a headache. I don't have headaches. And I said, I don't feel well. Went to the clinic. It's 8:02. I was in the clinic. And they tested me and, hey, you got the virus. And I said, well, you know, because you know, we don't prescribe the antiviral here, but because you probably want to talk to your family doctor. I had some other health conditions and stuff. And so I talked to my family doctor. And he says, well, and I said, well, okay, being old and fat worked for me that day. He said, because you're aging your weight, I'm going to give you the antiviral. So I took it and the testimony did great. Really, 24 hours, doing really, really good. At the same time, another man in Cookville, he's now lost part of his vision from the virus. Never heard of that before. It's a baffling thing. But if we treat it, so what do? We got vaccinated, we were aware, we just did things differently. We treat it like a real thing, right? It's a real risk. And we did things differently. I had friends of mine who were washing their groceries when they brought them home. You know, one lady, she was leaving them in the garage for so many days and so on like that. So, but what if we treated suicide like this? What if we treated suicide like a virus? Like it's a real thing that we can't see, but it's a real risk factor. And what would we do? Okay. So we know that previous attempts as a greater predictor of future lethality. That's evidence. So these people sort of are the most vulnerable, right? Didn't we talk about the vaccines for the most vulnerable first? The elderly, the sick, the underlying medical condition, the most vulnerable first. So what if we concentrated on the most vulnerable first? Why do we need to work on some things for them? And we're going to talk about some actionable things we can do for them. Clinical depression. This is a suicide. Not everyone who's depressed is suicidal. But very often suicidal people are depressed, right? But I find that people with high anxiety sometimes have equal suicide ideations that people have with clinical depression. Because they want to egress from, they want away from the anxiety. So hopelessness and helplessness, those statements are powerful. What about alcohol? Some of us work with people with substance use disorder. Alcohol use is comorbid with suicide. It's a different, we're getting add risk factors. It's just like we think of viruses, this risk factor, this risk factor, this risk factor, you know. And previously hospitalized for emotional disorders or more inclined to suicide. So we know the previous hospitalizations. So we begin to categorize people at risk and maybe begin working some things for them as well. Which again brings us to the new stuff with ACEs. Research is going on now. Are there anything we can do to moderate or minimize the impact of childhood ACEs? Or are there people with really big scores that seem to not be affected by it? They're not profoundly, we talked about initially the relationship between ACEs and resiliency. Resiliency reduced the impact of ACEs, the more resilient you were. So these are the 7 positive childhood experiences that tend to minimize the impact upon ACEs. A friend of mine's she was a kindergarten teacher. She had 18 kids in her classroom a few years ago. And she says, Mark, I have 18 kindergarten in my classroom, 5 and 6-year-olds. She says, you know how many of my 18 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds live with both biological parents? I said, 50%? She said, none. 0. That's one of the ACE scores. If it's for incarceration or substance abuse, that's 2 or 3. Mental illness, that's another one. So, and I mean, when I do Head Start trainings on ACEs every year, they said that's half our class have scores in the clinical range. Have scores of 4 or more. That's half our class. So these are the things that they're saying moderate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. What if we treat this as the new Moderna for suicide, or the new Pfizer for suicide? Why don't we take this back to people who make decisions within our faith communities or within our communities, community leaders, and say, listen, we need to create dialogue for families on how to talk about feelings. That addresses alexithymia stuff. I shared with someone earlier, my mother-in-law, she has Alzheimer's, and it's getting progressed pretty rapidly, and she's struggling with some aphasic stuff. My wife goes in Thursday afternoon to check on her parents after work, and my mother-in-law says, you know, something big happened. Something big happened. Something big happened. And she said, the Queen died. Yes, yes, yes. And she says, and I know the word I feel. She said, you feel sad? She said, yes, I feel sad. She said, I cried. And I said, you know what we need to do? I said, what? She said, we need to get a feelings chart up there as quick as we can. Because her dementia is progressing, but she understands powerful, strong emotions. She just needs some prompts. She said, well, maybe we need to do this for like bathroom and hungry and everything. I said, why not? Communication board. So how do we do this? How do we create cultures of this? I'm not promoting it. I don't have any investment, but our son and his wife, they're tremendous parents. They humble me all the time. I've already confessed being a bad dad. My son cried, but he said I wasn't, but I feel bad because he's such an awesome dad. But Griffin is soon 2 years old. He gets 30 minutes screen time a day. That's it. That's everything. That's it. You know, he didn't have any for the first 2 months of his life, no screen time. You know, there were friends, how do you get, you know, why do you play on the iPad to get your child to eat? And they said, our child doesn't have an iPad. And it would never happen at mealtime. But some people, my kid only eats about, you know, put the iPad out. He doesn't know what that is. But right now he watches Bluey. And I says, why Bluey? And my son says, because it teaches social emotional intelligence. I'm shamed by that. You know, I'm sort of the person out here sort of promoting this stuff. And he said, Dad, she said, I cried at one of the episodes. You know, I said, really? And he said, yeah. He says, it's done out in Australia or whatever. I think it's done, yeah. He said, it teaches social emotional intelligence to kids. Wow. You know, how many of us learned from Fred Rogers that some things were just okay? Yeah. I mean, I'd like to be the embodiment of Carl Rogers and Fred. I think they were cousins somewhere back in the day, right? I get them superimposed over each other, you know. And then I really confabulate it because I put Captain Kangaroo in there too. He was part of my childhood, you know. Captain Kangaroo came and spoke at Tech. And I think, well, we gotta get our captain, you know. So a little disappointed Mr. Green Cheeks wasn't with him, but anyways, it was still a good evening. Mr. Moose wasn't there either. Yeah. So, but look, participation in community traditions. This is where we're breaking down. What are our community traditions?
Church.
Yeah. But I mean, my issue with working with adolescent substance users is I have no spiritual language. It's secular. I mean, I make references to college students about biblical metaphors and say, who's Samson? What? I don't know what you're talking about. Who's Samson? You don't know about the guy in the long hair? No. I mean, these are 20-something, 18, 20 years. There's no language for spirituality. They don't have 12 steps to them? What? It's hard. It's not accessible to them. So, but we're losing. I mean, what if we treat these as the components of the vaccine? Feeling belonging in high school. How many want to go back and repeat high school?
Probably not.
Best days of your life, right?
Somewhere.
But you know, that's the communication. These are the best years of your life. I would make me suicidal if I had to think that was the best years. Awkward, social, weird. But that's the medication. I mean, that's the communication, the meta-communication that kids get. It's not going to be able to enjoy this. It's not going to be better than this. That's a lie. But if you're not connected, you don't have a safe base, you have a high ACE score, you don't have protective factors, and you want to get away from it, suicide's an option, a way of aggression. Feeling supported by friends, that's a whole thing. I mean, a generation of kids are fascinated with the show Friends that were not born with friends. I have to preach tomorrow, so sorry for you. You can do sermons, I guess. But tomorrow's the anniversary of 9/11. Okay, here's the reality. We have a whole generation that wasn't born yet. They're now emerging adulthoods. Think about it. Those iconic images that we have are old news riddles to them. They're emblazoned in our thought. We have flashbulb memory of that. Where were you? The Alan Jackson song, we all remember. Those of us who are around, and Mason was 6th grade?
Third.
Third grade. Third grade. Yeah, I wasn't born yet. What? So, but how do people make friends? How do we feel supported? Having at least 2 non-parents, adults who genuinely care. Those of us who are concerned about church things, the ratio is 6 non-related adults in the church community who keep you in the church community as an emerging adult. 6 relationships. I have young folks at church that can't name 6 adult members other than their parents. That's what keeps people in. So 2 non-parent who generally cared. Feeling safe, protected by adult in the home. Even if you have trauma, you had someone to go to.
But this is true for adults.
Well, yeah.
I have clients all the time, but one in particular this past week, I'm like, who knows you? No one knows me. No one in his life does he know well enough to confide in. There's no one he feels knows him. And I said, no wonder you feel lonely.
Mm-hmm. I believe that loneliness is the epidemic of our time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm working with recovering folks and talk about what may make you return to use. I don't like the word relapse. And there's a Indian Journal of Indian Psychiatry. I am weird to read more stuff. But the Indian Journal of Psychiatry told me more about recovery than a lot of the American journals of psychiatry told me about recovery. Because they broke it down to lapse, to simply return to use. Relapse is return to previous levels of use. And prolapse is taking a lapse and turning it to a positive direction. Yeah, following upward. That's a good. I like that. So, but then how do we sort of communicate that with folks? I mean, yes.
Just quickly, a resource that every practicing therapist should know about in the United States. You may have heard about it. Cigna funded a study on loneliness that came out in 2018, I think. It's free online, so if you do a search in whatever your search browser is, if you just just type in Cigna loneliness study, it'll pop right up. And it's 80 pages.
I didn't know that. That's great.
The interesting thing about the study is it said there's a pandemic of loneliness in the United States. Over half the people out of over 20,000 people said they were lonely sometimes or always. And when they graphed it by age, the younger you were, the more likely you were to be lonely. So about 75%, 17 to 24-year-olds said they were lonely.
And I find in my recovery folks that is one of the number one triggers of relapse or return to use. You know, is that loneliness. It's toxic.
Worse since COVID.
Yep, and worse since COVID. I mean, we're not. But I think that's something that this speaks to, right? So it's part of the virus, right? That's getting us. Is that abject feeling of loneliness. You know, the very first negative commentary, I can talk to you because my people, the very first negative commentary about creation, the very first negative comment about creation, it is not good for man to be alone. It was that was the only negative comment. It was good or very good. No, that part's not too good. It's not good for you. So it's not in we're relationally made for connection. We can get down to molecular level. That's how our neural networks. One cell gets up another cell gets another cell, and then we have a neural response. So these are the parts that this room can conceptualize moving forward in clinical practice. When I have a suicidal client, are there any of these things I can help with them in their life? I like the question, who knows you? Acronym. These are some of the basic stops, specifics of suicide plan. I remember being an intern. I was green, raw. Back in the days, back then, we didn't have a crisis program in mental health. Every clinician took a call. So part of your day, you were on call, and then you took a pager on the weekends, and so you got called on the weekends if someone showed up at the clinic or the center. So the part of my training is I had to be with someone on call. I remember this one clinician later, I think she was a really good clinician at the time. I thought, man, you are scaring me, because she was asking, do you have a plan? Okay, do you own a gun? Do you know how to load a gun? Do you know how to fire a gun? I'm thinking, what are you doing? My green cell was saying, you're putting ideas in this person's head. No, this person was doing a really good job of an assessment. Really good job in assessment. Because sometimes I'm going to blow myself up and don't access to blowing themselves up. Not too great a risk, right? But if someone says, yes, I'm going to overdose and I've got enough medication at home to do it, that's a really specific plan. And you have to get the specificity. I'm suicidal. Well, I'm not suicidal right now. I'm not going to do it right now. I had a client one time that says, I will die by suicide. He said, but not as long as my mom is living. No, first he said, not as long as my cat and my mama's living. Okay. This cat died a couple years ago. And then he said, I've been seeing him for a few years. I don't see him frequently. I see him about once a month now. And then we come one day, he says, I once said I would probably die by suicide if my cat died and my mama died. I said, yeah, I remember that. And he said, then I thought, how would it impact you? Wow. And I said, it would make me sad, because I think you're a pretty important person. I said, I think the world would miss a lot if you weren't here and stuff. But it was that relationship, that we progressed with. And he's a relatively young person and stuff. He said, I wonder how it would impact you. But we can have those conversations because I have conversations with clients about their death and about suicide. So you have to come on your own skin, and you have to sort of work and collaborate and consult. If you're under supervision, talk to your supervisor about these things. So timing, when? There are a lot of people who run around with ideations that have no immediate, they're not imminently going to do anything. So when? What are your options? Who can help? Who keep you safe? And how close are we to getting help? Now, this is just one acronym to work. So I'm going to show you some other things as well. But so this is the STOP assessment. The QPR, how many have gone through QPR training? Okay. QPR training is offered through the Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, and they will come to your church and do it for everybody in your church. I've told folks in Cookeville, I said, having a heart attack in Cookeville, Tennessee is one of the best places to have a heart attack. We have one of the best response rates. All of our emergency responders are 911 first responders, the fire department, ambulance, everything. So my son was a firefighter. They were very often, the fire department was the first on the scene. So he did CPR. He got a couple of awards for helping resuscitate people and stuff. But I said, we emphasize, many companies, have you gone through CPR training? Have you gone through CPR training? You have to have your CPR and certification. You have to carry your own car. We need to mandate QPR. If we want safer communities, everybody needs to go through QPR training. I wish after that happened in my church, I could think, man, we got to do QPR. We need other folks besides just the ministry team asking questions to folks. But it's just QPR questions about suicide. Do you have thoughts, feelings, plans? Don't be afraid to ask. Persuade. Let me get help, or come with me to find. Those warm handoffs are great. You can go with them or have them go with you. Or refer for help. Now, I'm the chairman of the ethics board for Tennessee Licensed Professional Counselor Association, so I get consultations from folks. And the folks, because I teach ethics at Tech, and I have colleagues that confer with me. One colleague called me one day and says, I need a consultation. I said, okay, great, you got time? What's going on? He said, I've got a client. She's very prominent in the community. She's actively suicidal. He said, I assessed her for risk. I said, I think she's imminent. She intends to shoot herself. And so I just need to know if this is okay. He says, I'm going to take possession of her handgun. And is that okay? And I said, no, that's probably not okay. You need to get a family member. You need to get someone else. That chain of custody question, I would not want front page of the paper. I said, think of the front page of the paper, what it would say, local therapist, client shoots herself. And I said, where's she right now? He says, well, she's gone home to get it. And I says, where are you right now? He says, I'm parked in front of her house. I said, okay, not a good plan. Not a good plan. I said, because she could hurt herself while you're there. I said, you don't need personal possession of her property. You need to get a family member or someone else to take that responsibility. That's not your role as a therapist to do. I said, you're doing a really good job about keeping her safe, but you need to think about some other liabilities as well. So you need to think about that. What sort of, how do you deal with these plans and stuff? Don't put yourself at risk too. So, but those warm handoffs, let me help get you to someplace. Let me have someone come to here. So in your region, you have a group that's responsible for all the adults in your region through your local community health agency. In our area, it's Volunteer Behavioral Health. They serve a big portion of Middle Tennessee. But then Youth Villages does for children up to the age of 18. I think most of the Youth Villages for kids and adults. There's your crisis number lines for someone in your community in crisis. The state has contracts with crisis providers. This is scaring me a little bit. If you have a suicidal client in your office, who do you call?
I call mobile crisis.
Okay. So in your area, it's
I just call mobile crisis. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a mobile crisis response for adults and for children in all areas across Tennessee. Okay. I'm thinking if you call 988, they'll connect you. And if you have an active client in your office, okay, you need to be able to access those services. Or in your church, whatever. And they're the state entities that are responsible for coming and evaluating people. Now, having some issues now, a lot of those assessments are done through telehealth. If short of getting hold of them, you get them to the ER. Okay? And in the state of Tennessee, this sounds weird, suicide's against the law in the state of Tennessee. That allows us to take someone and incarcerate them put in the hospital for a hold until we determine they're no longer a viable risk of harming themselves. 72 hours. If it goes beyond that, they can be adjudicated through a adjudication official, and then be held longer than that. So, yes.
I'm not sure exactly how to phrase this question, but I have had several clients who have been so traumatized by being taken to psych hospitals, and I find that a really difficult place to navigate ethically. I wonder if you could speak to that when they cause harm.
Yeah. Laura, thank you for sharing that, because it's a heavy question for me, because I've had those experiences as well.
Would you read that?
Laura shared that she's had clients who've been traumatized by that experience, being evaluated and going to a psych hospital. And I'm validating that that's been my experience as well with clients. It's just they're afraid of going back. And I remember one day a client came in and she says, Mark, she says, I'm just going to tell you, I am suicidal. She says, I've got medicine at home, and I don't trust myself. And I said, okay, how can I keep you safe for now? She said, well, I'm okay here. I said, okay, but I have other clients today. I said, what do you think needs to happen? She says, well, I can't go home because I don't trust myself. And I says, she said, and I don't want to go to the emergency room. And I don't want to go to mobile crisis stuff. And so I says, well, which hospital do you want to go to? And
You're tying my hands a little bit.
But okay, it worked. But she says, I would be okay with going to this hospital. And I said, okay. I said, can you give me consent to call the hospital and let me talk to them? And she did. And the hospital said, okay, I've got to identify who I was. I can't do the 604, 603. I'm not certified by the state to do those. I said, she'll need that done. And she wants to go there because she's been there before. And they said, just send her here to our ER. So I said, okay. And she says, we'll do that assessment, and then she'll have to be assessed again by the admitting doctor there. I said, that's fine. And so I said, no. I said, can I call your husband? She said, she was reluctant. She said, yes. And I said, well, okay, so we're going to call your husband. And we're going to wait here till he can come pick you up. So she just sat out in the waiting room. I was trying to be honoring her and the reality. I wasn't going to say, hey, it's not going to be that bad this time, because it could be that bad or worse this time. I mean, in our local hospital in Cookville, we'd really have people sitting in the ER hallways waiting for beds. Children and adolescents sometimes for over a day or two. That's not humane, by the way. Yes. I grew up in a family with a lot of mental illness. I mean, psychosis was not necessarily something scary for me. Dementias were not scary for me. But I know some physicians' their perspective is zero psychosis. And it's only psychosis bothers me is when it's telling them to do something harmful to self or others. But I'm uncomfortable with a lot of levels of psychosis. I'm comfortable with clients with suicidal thoughts. I'd rather, like Bruce said, I'd rather have discussions with them about their suicidal thoughts on an ongoing basis. That's part of my care. I mean, we're managing this. I mean, lovely if we could ameliorate it, but we can't. We live with it. But that's part of what we do. We sit with people. That's how we've been honored to serve. We sit with people in their situation. So let's move forward. Okay, this is QPR. I'm a big advocate for it. This is from the case manager ethical standard casebook. Another little thing: is there a plan? How serious is the thought of death? This person have means available. These are important things. Who would stop with him or her? What kind of emotional support is available home or elsewhere? I went through ASSIST training a year or so ago. If you have the chance to go through ASSIST training to get certified, it's 12 hours, pretty intense, a lot of role plays. It's probably one of the best trainings I've ever been to for suicide interventions. They're out of Canada. It's real expensive to become a trainer. That's aspirationally where we would like to be as a program at Tech. We'd like to have a couple of trainers. Always has true trainers, but I mean, it is really good. It's the best training because it's not it's not assess and pass off. So many treatment programs is assess and pass off. You know, you're suicidal, let's get you someplace. You're suicidal, let's get you someplace. Assist, the philosophy is, how can I keep you safe for now? It's not how can I make you not suicidal, but how can I keep you safe for now? And it's really, really good because it's really, the concept is safe for now. And I can't endorse it strongly enough. The Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network is trying to be setting up regional assist trainings. Sometime, if you're lucky, in our area, we were funded through a grant. We had to pay like a $50 fee, but then once you complete the training, you got reimbursed. They had a grant to do it. But some of the best training for it's not just for clinicians; it's lay people. So get some other folks trained as well. My administrative office person, she quit work. She quit work some time ago, but I have trained her because she took the phone calls. She saw people in the waiting room. So here's some signs you need to recognize. Let me know if someone seems different or someone seems So I would recommend assist training for anybody. It's how to keep people safe for now. But it's not just assess, you're suicidal, pass on. We had a local situation in our area at a high school that their safety plan for suicide was to call the local police. If a student reported that they were suicidal, they called the local police. So we had an incident, suicidal high school student, local police came out. That student left the school in handcuffs, put in the back of a squad car when the bell let out and all the students were coming out of school. That student was being treated as a criminal because they were suicidal. Now, be that student and try to come back to school. Laura Shannonhouse, she does Georgia State University. She's doing a lot of great work down there. She's researching area suicide. They were doing work in the school systems to train intervention people using this sort of the assist model. But they recognized the people in the school that they needed to train were not the people you usually think of. You know who they were training in some of the schools? The cafeteria worker. Because she saw who ate, who didn't eat. She was better. Sometimes the custodial staff. They were asking students, who would you go to if you had a problem? And it wasn't the school counselor always, and it wasn't the summer teacher. It was Mr. So-and-so. He always has time for me. It was, Mrs. So-and-so in the cafeteria. She knows I like this or I don't like that. And so they said, let's get real interventionist in here. Salvador Minuchin, he was resistant to it initially, but his family systems person, he said, we need to train lay people in the community how to help families. Because they can relate to people who look more like them than people who look like me. And so training lay people to work with folk. There's parts of what we do professionally that we don't expect them to do. There's parts of what we need to do that we need to train a whole community of people in doing this. Yes, we feel burdened because we carry the burden ourselves. Yes.
And I wonder what that common denominator is amongst the people in the community that someone feels safe to go to and open up, or that they know if they say something or this person. What is that?
I think is that they, on some level, they recognize this person's empathetic and not judgmental.
I might add, and has integrity with that. It's not a soft, caring voice. It's genuine.
Yeah. Well, we can borrow. We can borrow also from some assistance perspective. That Virginia said here that they're a congruent person. Whenever they are, there they are. They're never one way or the other. They're never duplicitous. They're never a mask wearer. They're always that. They're always that. They're never different. So there's that congruency and stuff. So these are skills and traits that make these people very, very helpful in doing this. Yes? 5? Okay. What are you going to take away? What are you going to take away today? Anybody? Yes?
We have a violence problem in Memphis. It's huge right now. And what I'm taking away from this is that this may be a blueprint for how we can deal with this kind of suicidal, non-suicidal violence that's happening, this homicidal violence that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these principles that you're talking about will work for us as we think about how to deal with Memphis from an epidemic.
My wife's nephew's he's in his medical internship down there, and they live in Memphis, and they called and said we're sheltered, we're fine and stuff. It was 2 blocks from their house. The shootings took place. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, get too far in the weeds, but Freud talked about the will to die. I thought that was the Dantos, the death wish. That was the Grog man. Frankl says no. It's the will to have meaning. It's not the will to die. It's the will to have meaning. So if we can find what's meaningless in this community and find a way to create meaning and hope, that things can be better. Yes.
With the last couple of minutes, self-care and post-suicide. Okay, self-care. What we're doing in this room is a form of self-care. Talking about one of the hardest parts of our jobs, right? And having it in real terms. This is tough. This is tough for any of us. Also with self-care is that self-care is not something you do after the crisis, it's something you did every day. Mm-hmm. And self-care is subjective to you. You've got to know what and so we're in the weeds right now with our master's students. I created a little assessment, the MEPS assessment. You have to assess your mental, emotional, physical, spiritual strengths and understand you move through life with your deferred way of doing it. So you put your arms across your chest like this. Everyone do it? Put your arms across your chest, if you will. Right over left or left over right. Do it the other way. Does it feel awkward? It feels real awkward. We all have a preferred way of going through life. For some people, they go through the physical self. Some people, the mental self, emotional self, spiritual self. You move through life that way, but you have to treat all 4 domains as something that's relative to self-care. How am I taking myself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? And you have to move through life with a preparation and a plan for that. And we've gone through a lot that challenged us. And some of the things we always said we couldn't do in those areas. But you have to practice. That has to be a practice. We preach it all the time to our clients. We're some of the worst people to do it. But how do you do that? And I can't prescribe to you how to do it. You have to figure out which is your primary domain. Make sure you're doing those exercises or whatever that is in that area. Then your secondary. But you have to address all 4 domains because you're inextricably holistic. You have those 4 cells. And you have to address all those. And moving through life with addressing those and having a plan for that. So our master students have to write a self-care plan as master students. How am I going to address myself physically? How am I going to address emotionally, spiritually? But understand you have a preferred domain. I had a client several years ago. I don't intentionally see eating disorder persons. I was working in a psychiatrist's office. She came in after we were working. She says, I've struggled all my life with bulimia and anorexia, but I've got that under control. I'm not here for that. It's okay, fine. We're not going to address that. But later, she revealed to me that she exercised like 6 hours a day, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours at night, and that kept her kept her bulimia under control. She comes in to therapy one day. She's on crutches. So what's wrong? She says, I've got stress fractures in both my legs. Guess what happened to her bulimia and anorexia? Her domain in which she was dealing with it was taken from her. So we spent some time, okay, what are some other things you can do that are equally as effective as running and physical activity to manage this? She was scaring me because she was eating so little. So it gets robbed. Now, if you ever follow Fowler's work on faith development, as we get older, we get more spiritual. I had a colleague, and we used to have these conversations. she was from social work background, and she says, you know, Mark, she says, I'm not comfortable dealing with spirituality with clients. I think we need to refer them to their pastors or their rabbis or whatever. And I said, Barbara, if I could talk to my clients about their sexual activity, sure I can talk about their spiritual activities. She said, I don't think that sets the role of therapists. Of course, my integrationist, I was arguing. She leaves community mental health. She goes work for home health. She calls me one day. She said, can we have lunch? And so I said, well, yeah, we'll be back for lunch. And we were meeting at a restaurant. And she says, well, I got to tell you, you were right and I was wrong. I said, wait a minute. You've never said that before. Can we record this? Can you say that again? And I said, about what? And she said, the spirituality thing. She says, all my little old people, all they want to talk about is death, died, and Jesus. And she says, I just go right there with them. She saw different people then. And she saw the relevance of it. Secular psychology is trying to deny it forever, but it's part of the human condition, spirituality. The Army developed a comprehensive soldier fitness test, and one of the domains that they measure soldier comprehensive fitness is spirituality. You know, they define spirituality as what one holds as sacred. Yeah. It's what one holds as sacred. I like that definition. But it's part of it. So we do that. If you don't have a consultant, you need a consultant. I don't care if you've been practicing 30 minutes or 30 years, I have a consultant. Sometimes you can do that very formally. We meet in staff, but that's informed consent for your clients you're seeing. If you're going to step into formal consultation with colleagues, that probably needs to appear in your informed consent with your clients. I will discuss, certain aspects of the clinical parts of your case without any identifiers with colleagues, and that needs to be properly informed consent. Yes.
I know I've talked too much today.
No.
Speaking of consultation, maybe this is a decently good benediction to this, but Dick Brule had to leave a minute ago. But about 12 years ago, I had a different client that I thought was imminently suicidal, and it really was troubling me. And by the way, I worry about all of us that work with chronically suicidal people all the time. And he taught me a lesson in that consultation about acknowledging our limitations. And here's what Dick said to me. He said, you've been a hospice chaplain before? I said, yes. He said, what if your client is terminally ill? Would it help you to think of yourself as a hospice chaplain? Folks, sometimes we're hospice chaplains, and people are going to kill themselves. And so far, you may have more recent research than I've seen, Dr. Loftis, but so far I don't see empirical evidence that our suicide prevention techniques are changing the rates of suicide. Really having an impact. So I'm just saying again, we have to acknowledge when we can't succeed in keeping people from killing themselves. Sometimes we're hospice chaplains.
I like that metaphor. I like that analogy. Bruce is right. We're not seeing the needle shift in the right direction.
And this doesn't go to it, but it goes to what hospice chaplains say often, which is there are worse things than death. There are a lot worse things than death.
But we also have to understand, like in the ACA code, we have to acknowledge that certain states and provinces have the right to enact physician-assisted suicide. That's protected in that state. And within your competencies, you've got to be able to work with people who are making that choice. Because that's a value that some people have encoded into the state law. It's not Tennessee. Also, the two-hour suicide prevention that's being placed upon all mental health professionals every 4 years. If you're licensed, you have to do your 2 hours of training.
I think we all have to have it by the end of this year.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So hopefully this counts. So maybe
that's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. Okay. So please ask me. Okay. So, but also just being very mindful that that's something you have to keep track of. But if you're licensed, your renewal cycle is every 2 years. So I don't have them catch you on 4 years. Because you could renew, but having your starting point, but I'd encourage you to just do it on a yearly basis as much as possible, 2 hours stuff. But that was mandated. What was really interesting, people who see people who are suicidal most frequently were taken out. They were given an exemption Medical doctors and nurses were given exemption from having to have the suicide training. They don't have to have it, but about 60-something% of people commit suicide, saw the medical provider within 6 weeks of their suicide. But they were exempted. The people who don't know how to screen were exempted from screening. The people who screen all the time were mandated screeners. That was some political things that I didn't like. So, because we do it all the time. But people were exempted who needed the training.
I once did therapy, excuse me.
And I'll close this off.
Okay.
I once did therapy with a TA therapist, and he did not say this to me, but he was a teacher, and so I heard him say it in another forum. He asked he asked his clients who he was suspicious of having suicidal ideation if they were going to commit suicide. And if they said, I don't know, or whatever, he would indicate somewhat with tough love that he did not want to work with people who had already decided to do suicide as a choice, because they would not be working with all ego states, and he would be wasting his time. And so there was a difference, to use your experience, there's a difference between suicide prevention and psychotherapy, I think. Which, if with that theory in place anyway.
Well, in the DBT model of Marshall Linehan, that you have to get the client to take the suicide off the table. You know, and if they do make a gesture, then they can stop being your client.